Narrow Escape, Shaleslip Manor, Book 1. Written by EmmalineHoffmeister. Dedication. You wouldn't want me as your doctor. I would be terrible. I prefer to make people suffer. Some people even die. Trust me. You are better off with me as an author. You are welcome. Chapter 1. It was well before the usual time for callers when someone knocked on the rickety wooden door of the Poe residence in the village of Breckhill. Martha Poe dried her hands on the apron tied around her waist and then opened the door, a sudden feeling of foreboding twisting her insides. The feeling intensified when she recognized Mr. Jonas Hammond standing on her doorstep, hat in hand. With a wary eye, she regarded the inquisitor in charge of the case against the notorious Derby Mill lead mine masters. The door creaked as Mrs. Poe opened it wider and wordlessly invited him to enter. Ducking his head to keep from hitting it on the low lintel, Mr. Hammond stepped over the threshold into the dimly lit lodging. Though the morning sun shone brightly outside, the light did not reach the Poe home, which stood in the shadow of a larger building across the street. Martha did not offer him a seat, nor take one herself. Instead, she stood with the wooden table between them, desperately seeking answers.
What are you doing here? Tell me how my Matthew fares. He has been gone for weeks, and I've heard nary a word from him.
Her husband, Matthew, was in hiding. He knew a great deal concerning the immoral, unconscionable, and outright illegal business practices of the Derby Mill masters, and he had agreed to share this knowledge with magistrates, judges, and anyone else who would care to listen. The Derby Mill masters were not forgiving men, and if they found her husband, his life was surely forfeit. She desperately wanted to hear any news of him, but at the same time, she feared what Mr. Hammond might say.
I am sorry, Mrs. Poe, but I am afraid I bear sad tidings. Perhaps you should take a seat.
Good Lord, what has happened to my Matthew? Where is he?
She asked, the words tumbling out in a rush. Her chin trembled.
I am afraid Mr. Poe is dead.
Dead? How?
She staggered, her hands grasping at the table to hold her up. Her mind swirled, her breathing shallow and erratic. Matthew was the only person she cared for in the entire world.
Come sit next to the fire,
Mr. Hammond coaxed as he moved around the table.
No, tell me what happened,
she cried. Her knuckles were white from the strength of her grip on the table's edge.
He was shot,
Mr. Hammond admitted quietly.
By those men. Matthew said they would kill him if he agreed to testify. He knew. Curse him, he knew. You were supposed to protect him. What use is the law if you cannot even keep him safe?
Tears steadily flowed down her cheeks, but her voice was surprisingly strong. Mr. Hammond remained silent in the face of her grief, recognizing her need to rant. Martha bowed her head and took a deep breath.
I want to see him.
His wounds are of such a nature. He would not wish you to see him in his present state, but remember him as he was.
A strangled cry left Martha's throat, and her knees nearly buckled.
His body is in Masson, where he will be buried this afternoon.
Mr. Hammond continued gently.
I will take you there and bring you home after the service.
No, he can't be buried in Masson. He always wanted to be buried in Shalebury, under the shadow of Mam Tor, near his foster mother. His father would never allow him to be buried with his real mother.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Poe, but you mistake me. I have paid all the funeral expenses for his burial in the Masson Parish Cemetery, not the Poe family plot. If you want him buried elsewhere, you must do it at your own expense.
I haven't the money. You know I haven't.
Martha put her hand over her mouth in an ineffectual attempt to stifle a sob. She tried to calm herself, tried to breathe, but the air would not come. Her legs buckled under her, and she collapsed to her knees. She kept one hand over her mouth, but the other still maintained a white-knuckled grip on the table's edge as she sobbed, her head sagging until her chin touched her chest.
How may I help? Is there someone I could send for? Your family or a friend, perhaps?
Mr. Hammond stepped closer, his hand outstretched.
Stay away from me!
Martha screamed. It took a minute or two for her to regain her composure, but soon she rallied. She smeared her tears across her cheeks with her hands, ignoring the handkerchief Mr. Hammond proffered. Then, taking a deep breath, she stood and said,
Very well. If he must be buried in Masson, I must accept it. Give me a few minutes, and I will gather my things.
As she readied herself for the trip to Masson, her mind turned to practical matters with a speed that shocked her. Though her husband was dead and her heart lay in tatters, she was already calculating how long her meagre savings would last and how much extra work she would have to do to support herself. She could take in extra washing at home, so long as her employer at the laundry did not find out, and a boarder could help her pay the rent. Matthew had not left her with much, but she would survive. She would press on. That's what strong women did, and Martha Poe was strong. Freddie Knox sat with his back against the cold, hard bricks of the abandoned lodgings across the street and 3 doors down from the Poe residence. After years as an action agent in the British Secret Service, spying on a common washerwoman was an irritating task far below his abilities. The job sounded intriguing at first. His employer wished him to dig up lead mining trade agreements information. He would have turned it down if Freddie knew where the position would take him. It was too late now. He was too deep to get out. Twice, Freddie had tried to discontinue his professional relationship with Lord Sharpson and the Derby Mill masters, but they well and truly had him over a barrel. He bitterly regretted ever meeting the masters in person. They had only to reveal his true identity to certain people in his checkered past to ruin him, and they had no scruples in making such threats to ensure his continued loyalty. Lord Sharpson had some surprisingly low connections, and Freddie had no doubt he could make good on his threats. He would do their bidding for now and bide his time until he could make a clean break from them. In his hands was a piece of softwood. He often passed the hours whittling. It was the perfect pastime for a man on a mission such as his. Whittling allowed Freddie to keep a surreptitious eye on the comings and goings at the Poe residence while looking like he belonged there. He had set up a stall where he displayed his carvings, and he appeared to all the world to be nothing more than an opportunistic street vendor, taking advantage of the rent-free real estate. When he was not gathering information for aristocrats and businessmen, ladies and gentlemen from every county in England sought him out to commission grand carvings. As far as they knew, art was his only profession. While watching Mrs. Poe, he had crafted and sold 3 small rowboats, complete with a pair of oars and a pudgy wooden oarsman, and given away several wooden soldiers and animals of all descriptions. He always gave away more than he sold to the urchins who roamed the village, and his stint as a street vendor was not likely to be profitable. Not, at least, where money was concerned. He still had hopes for the other matter that had brought him here, though they were becoming slimmer by the day. Until today, Mrs. Poe had gone about the same daily routine, scrubbing at the laundry, more scrubbing at the church, yet more scrubbing at home, and then a simple meal before retiring not long after the sun went down. Freddie expected today to be the same, but it proved otherwise early on. Before her usual departure time, a man dressed as an inquisitor approached her door. Freddie watched as the inquisitor went inside. Then he left his stall, crossed the street, and leaned casually against Mrs. Poe's wall, with his ear very near the crack in the door. He listened long enough to learn what he needed and returned to his usual place. The information that Mr. Poe was dead and soon to be buried in the Masson cemetery was what Lord Sharpson and his associates most wanted to know. Freddie scrawled a nearly illegible note on a dirty scrap of paper. He was folding it when he espied the inquisitor and Mrs. Poe leaving together. Seeing a boy of nearly 11, Freddie motioned for him to approach. He was a regular at Freddie's stall. He was a smart and steady lad who liked the wooden soldiers and horses best, and, to Freddie's despair and delight, he could not read a jot.
Want to earn a farthing?
Freddie asked, holding up a coin in front of the boy.
Yes, sir.
The boy answered, his eyes wide with anticipation.
Take this message to the 2-story brick house on the corner of Main and Broad. Can you do that?
Course I can.
Freddie handed over the note and the farthing.
You make sure it gets there. I'll not be pleased if you are lax with the job.
You can rely on me,
The boy said, throwing a mock salute before he took off running in the direction instructed. The lad reminded Freddie of himself at that age, always ready to run an errand for a coin or two. That was before his experiences in the Secret Service made him suspicious of everyone. More than a few men in his former profession, himself included, had been raised more by the cold streets than by a mother's gentle hand. Such an upbringing better prepared them for life in the service. To excel required a certain finesse. Finesse with a pistol or a dagger or with information. The latter was Freddie's specialty. He knew things, and if he did not, he had the means to discover them. Only Martha Poe struggled to hold back tears of grief at her husband's gravesite in the Masson Cemetery. Her tears would have seemed out of place in this strange gathering. Aside from herself and Mr. Hammond, the only other onlooker was a stodgy journalist for the London Gazette. The ceremony was one of efficiency, not emotions. 4 strong lads hired by Mr. Hammond dug the grave and assisted with the burial. They pulled the coffin from the dead wagon and lowered it into the ground with thick ropes wrapped around their calloused hands. A young curate recited a memorized burial service over Mr. Poe's grave without looking at the Bible he held before him. The unpretentious words were meant to be a tribute to Mr. Poe's life. With each word the clergyman spoke, Martha wanted to pummel him or Mr. Hammond. She wanted to scream aloud that everything was wrong. Her husband should not be dead. He should not be buried in Masson Cemetery. Matthew hated Masson and all that it represented. It broke her heart afresh that she could not afford to bury him in Shaleslip as he had wished. The expense would have ruined her, leaving her less than nothing to live on. The curate completed his recitation, and Martha stepped forward on trembling legs to throw a handful of dirt on the coffin. When no one else moved, one gravedigger gave her a pitying look and added his own handful of dirt. Mr. Hammond gave a start, as if only then recalling why they were all there, and hastened to follow suit. It took all Martha's strength of will not to leap into the grave, scoop up the dirt, and throw it back in the inquisitor's face. Though the effort cost her dearly, she held her tears in check and watched the coffin disappear as the gravediggers went about the business of burying her husband. Not until the fresh mound of earth was tamped down did she turn away and walk to the inquisitor's carriage with a stiffened spine. The curate and the journalist walked with Mr. Hammond from the gravesite. The journalist was the first to speak.
With the loss of Mr. Poe as your key witness, how will it affect your case against the Derby Mill masters?
The short, heavy-set man held a pencil in his pudgy fingers, poised to scribble notes in his small notebook. He did not bother to look up at Mr. Hammond as he answered.
It will no doubt make my job more difficult, but the loss is not so significant that the case cannot move forward,
responded Mr. Hammond.
Is Mr. Poe's death connected with the recent deaths of Lord Grange and Mr. Ball?
Further investigation will be necessary before I can definitively answer that. Do you have other questions?
Not at this time,
the journalist said, closing the notebook and stuffing it and his little pencil in his waistcoat pocket. He bowed and took his leave, exiting the cemetery from the south entrance near the main road, where his phaeton waited at the wooden tie post. Mr. Hammond hated journalists as much as he hated criminals. They were sensationalistic gossip-mongers who hampered the progress of his inquisitions, twisted facts, and misreported events to sell more papers. Mr. Hammond watched the man climb into the phaeton and set off at a smart clip, before addressing the curate who remained at his side.
Thank you for performing the ceremony on such short notice. I will see the church is compensated for your troubles.
Will the death of this man truly not jeopardize your case?
The quiet sincerity with which the curate broached his query resonated with Mr. Hammond. He could not comprehend lying to a man of the cloth. He bowed his head and admitted,
The case falls apart without the testimony of Mr. Poe. Now, if you will excuse me, I must get Mrs. Poe back to Breckhill.
Chapter 2. Before the handsome and wealthy Mr. Gregory Royse married, most of the Shaleslip Manor staff expected the master to marry a rich and haughty woman of society. Such women had been setting their caps at Mr. Royse for years, despite his fearsome aunt, Lady Charlotte, insisting he was promised to his cousin Mary. Everyone expected, perhaps even hoped, the future Mrs. Royse would be the type to lounge around her rooms until afternoon, thus giving them a morning's peace before rousing herself to interfere in the household's running in a desultory fashion. Such a mistress was a reasonable expectation, for many households throughout the country had fallen under the care of such blasé women. Mrs. Marjorie Royse-Wells was the stark opposite of everyone's expectations. She was a lively woman who did not keep the hours of fashionable London and tended to household matters in a gentle yet firm manner everyone respected. After only 4 months of marriage, she was a beloved addition to the family and Shaleslip Manor. Though the lingering chill of the winter months had only recently dissipated into the warmer spring climate, the staff had twice discovered the newlyweds on brisk morning walks at dawn. Everyone knew the walks were entirely Mrs. Royse's doing. Before his marriage, Mr. Royse had never engaged in sunrise romps around the gardens. Few fashionable women of London would consider rising so early, for how would they ever stay awake through all the balls and soirees they were socially obligated to attend? This glorious spring morning, the sky had been bright with hope and promise. Eager to take advantage of the fine weather, Marjorie had persuaded her husband to take a turn about the North Gardens. That had been nearly an hour ago, and now it was well past dawn. The sky still held scattered colour from the magnificent sunrise seen over the peak of Mam Tor. They had watched the sunrise together, but now her stomach was protesting further exploration and begged to return to Shaleslip Manor.
Shall we return to the house and break our fast?
Gregory asked with a chuckle after hearing the gentle rumble of his wife's stomach as they meandered along the dewy walkways. He increased his pace, tugging slightly on her arm when she failed to keep up. Gregory was a man of action. Once he had decided upon a thing, he was wont to carry it out without delay. Marjorie was endeavouring to teach him to consult the wishes of others, namely herself, before rushing off headlong.
Patience, Gregory. I shall not starve before we reach the breakfast room.
The laughter in Marjorie's voice was a boon to Gregory. For far too long, he had lived his life without the companionship of a woman. For all her goodness, his sister was too reserved, too in awe of him to laugh at him. But now, after just a few short months of marriage to a woman who brought him such joy, he could not imagine how he had survived so long without her. His life could only be described as euphoric, and it was all because of Marjorie. She made him happy. Marjorie pulled away from him and stopped beside a cluster of tulips.
How lovely these are. Tulips are one of my favourite flowers. Let me pick a few before we return.
Gregory stood back and watched as his handsome wife picked every tulip but one.
If you love them so, why did you not pick them all?
He asked, offering her his arm. Marjorie adored his quizzical expression.
I could not bear to leave the bed empty without a single bloom. Others will join it soon enough, and in the meantime, anyone who passes by may still enjoy the beauty of that one majestic tulip, while we enjoy these.
She raised the bouquet to her nose, breathed in the enticing scent of the peach-coloured blooms, and then offered it to Gregory to smell. He breathed in and said,
I never knew tulips had a sweet scent. I thought they were known for their beauty alone.
Few varieties have a scent like this one. The gardener calls them apricot beauty. He is right, is he not? They certainly are beautiful.
Marjorie smelled the flowers again, a smile as sweet as the perfume of the tulips, overspreading her face as they walked to the breakfast room. Oh, how Gregory loved his dear bride and her delightful outlook on the world. As was customary since the newlyweds came to Shaleslip, they sat at breakfast alone, eating and discussing their plans for the day. The servants were stationed outside the doors, close at hand should they be needed, while allowing the couple privacy.
Shall I expect you at tea today?
Marjorie asked, before taking a bite of a muffin slathered with strawberry preserves.
Certainly. Nothing will take me away from the house this morning. I will join you at 11 in the sitting room. Would you like to accompany me on a call to the Baxter farm this afternoon? Mr. Baxter has agreed to fallow his ground this year. I must meet with him to prepare a list of his family's needs and expenses for the coming year.
Yes, I would like to go with you. Mrs. Baxter is nearing her confinement, and neither she nor Mr. Baxter have family nearby. I have prepared a few gifts for the babe, and had Mrs. Jones fill a basket for the family. If you approve, I plan to send one of the downstairs maids to them to help after the babe arrives. She can tend to the housework and the other 2 children while Mrs. Baxter recovers.
Thank you, Marjorie.
Said Gregory.
For what?
For caring for the Shaleslip tenants as much as I do. It pleases me you have taken an interest in the families and their needs.
What is the mistress of Shaleslip Manor supposed to do but care for those who rely on the estate?
Another woman might have begrudged the task and delegated it to the servants. Many do, you know. But not you.
Gregory reached over and took Marjorie's hand. Lifting it to his lips, he kissed her knuckles and said,
I love you, Marjorie.
And I love you, Gregory.
A knock came upon the door.
Enter!
Gregory called out, releasing Marjorie's hand and returning his attention to his breakfast.
Mr. Jonas Hammond to see you, sir.
Mr. Jones announced, entering with the Inquisitor's card on a silver tray for Mr. Royse's inspection.
Please show him to my study and tell him I will come directly.
Mr. Jones bowed and retreated, closing the door behind him.
I wonder what brings Mr. Hammond here so early in the day.
Gregory said, glancing at his pocket watch. Tucking it back into his pocket, he hurried to finish his breakfast.
Who is this Mr. Hammond, my dear?
Marjorie inquired.
He is the Inquisitor over the whole of Derbyshire.
Why do you suppose he has come here?
Marjorie asked.
I hope there is no trouble with the tenants.
I shouldn't think so. If you will excuse me, I will go to him now.
Yes, of course. You will find me in the sitting room when your meeting ends.
Gregory took his leave of his wife and went to his study with long, purposeful strides. Upon entering, he found Mr. Hammond and another man. The second man was a little dirty and unkempt, and had an arm cradled in a blood-stained sling tied around his neck. His gaze remained on the floor. He never looked up even to acknowledge Mr. Royse's entrance.
Mr. Hammond, it is good to see you, sir. To what do I owe the honour of this visit?
Mr. Royse shook Mr. Hammond's hand and then took a seat in the high-backed leather chair behind his partner's desk.
Thank you for seeing me with no notice, Mr. Royse. I apologize for the hour, but we could not avoid it. I need your help.
You need only ask. The entirety of my support and Shaleslip's resources are at your disposal.
I hoped you would say as much.
Pointing to the other man, he continued,
This is Mr. Matthew Poe.
Mr. Poe kept his gaze trained on the ground, but he gave a small bob of his head in acknowledgement.
Mr. Poe is the primary witness in our case against the Derby Mill-led minemasters. I need your help to keep him safe. An attempt was made on Mr. Poe's life. He was set upon a few nights ago by an unknown number of men who chased him through Masson Wood and fired upon him. As you can see, they came close to succeeding.
And you have not caught those responsible?
Gregory asked solemnly.
Not as such, no. Do you know Lord Sharpson?
Gregory blinked.
Yes. Sharpson Manor is but 20 miles from here. You don't mean...
I do. He may not have fired the gun himself, but he certainly ordered it done.
Why?
Gregory asked.
Lord Sharpson owns Derby Mill. He holds the largest share in the mine.
I know,
Gregory said.
though I do not know the particulars of the case against him and the other masters. I am aware of its continuance.
Parliament has been discussing the reduction of tariffs on foreign leads. If the tariff decreases, imports will increase, and the local lead mining industry could suffer. There are other considerations more local to us due to the extensive spoils the mine offers for constructing and maintaining the road from Sheffield to Manchester. I cannot divulge all the particulars, though I can tell you all 6 masters are accused of threatening, bribing, and even murdering men who support the tariff reduction. Among their victims are Lord Henry Grange and his steward, Mr. Ball. Lord Grange, you see, enjoyed an influential position in Parliament and supported reduced tariffs. He refused to accept their bribes or be cowed by their threats, and Mr. Ball had the great misfortune to be standing too near his lordship when the assassins struck.
What does this have to do with Mr. Poe?
Gregory questioned.
Mr. Poe has worked at Derby Mill for several years. He held a minor clerical position, easily overlooked, yet ideally placed for information gathering. He has agreed to testify against Lord Sharpson and the other 5 masters. His testimony and the evidence he has will ensure a guilty verdict. Without him, we have nothing but hearsay.
Who else knows he is here?
No one. We used his being shot to stage his death and held a mock funeral, which took place yesterday. Not even his wife knows he yet lives. So long as he stays out of sight, there should be no risk to yourself or your people.
Risk or not, we will do our duty to the law and our country. Shaleslip Manor has plenty of room for Mr. Poe, and I will see he is well cared for until you return for him. You have my word.
Thank you, Mr. Royse. I knew I could count on you.
Mr. Poe spoke in a timid voice as Mr. Hammond turned to go.
Mr. Hammond, sir, with all due respect, I must write to my wife.
I'm sorry, Mr. Poe, but I cannot allow it. It is far too dangerous.
Sir, I cannot have her thinking I am dead and all is lost. It is too cruel. My Martha did nothing wrong and does not deserve to suffer. You said she couldn't know before the funeral, and I agreed to that. But it cannot matter now.
All right, I will allow you to write her a short letter, but you must let me read it before it is sent. If she is being watched, she must still appear to grieve you, and you mustn't tell her where to find you. I will not have you jeopardizing the Royses. Mr. Royse, may we beg the use of your writing desk?
He indicated to the delicate writing desk near the larger desk Mr. Royse sat behind.
That is Mrs. Royse's writing desk, though I am certain she would not object.
Gregory said. The small writing desk in the corner near the window had been placed there under Marjorie's direction, so she might be near her husband when she wrote her letters, and he conducted his personal or business correspondence. Mr. Poe took a seat and accepted the proffered paper and writing utensil produced by Mr. Royse. It did not take long for Mr. Poe to complete his letter. He handed it to Mr. Hammond to read. The Inquisitor declared the letter acceptable, sealed it, addressed it, and handed it to Gregory, who rang the bell for Mr. Jones.
Jones, please send in Mrs. Royse. Then see this letter goes out with the others. Add a penny to the post to have it delivered. Return to me as soon as you are done. I have more tasks for you.
Mr. Jones accepted the letter and said,
At once, sir.
Bowing, he left the room to do Mr. Royce's bidding. Moments later, Marjorie's light knock came upon the door of his study.
Come in, my dear.
Gregory met her at the door, leading her to her favourite chair near the fireplace. Before she sat, he introduced her to Mr. Hammond and Mr. Poe.
Good day, sirs,
Marjorie said, curtsying to the visitors.
My dear, I am sorry there is no more notice, but Mr. Poe will stay with us for a while. Can you have a room prepared for him?
It is no inconvenience. I keep the blue room on the 3rd floor prepared for unexpected visitors. Will that do?
The blue room was the favourite of Marjorie's father, Mr. Wells, who, after allowing the newlyweds 2 months of uninterrupted peace, had gleefully taken to visiting when he was least expected.
Yes, I am sure it will be adequate for our guest.
Marjorie rang the bell and sent the servant who answered it scampering to the housekeeper with a list of instructions. Then she turned to Mr. Poe.
Your room will be ready shortly. May I call a footman for your trunk?
There is no trunk, ma'am.
Your bag, then?
Marjorie darted a fleeting glance to Gregory, who shook his head slightly in the negative.
No bag either.
Mr. Poe shifted uncomfortably.
How dreadfully inconvenient for you. We must remedy that. I will have Mr. Jones find suitable clothing for your stay with us. I have no doubt we will find something to meet your needs.
You are too kind, ma'am.
Mr. Poe seemed almost as discomfited by Marjorie's charity as he was by his unfortunate position. Noting this, she tried her utmost to put him at ease while they waited for word that his room was ready. It had been remarked before that Marjorie had a talent for conversing easily with strangers, but Mr. Poe proved too reticent even for her considerable powers. After a largely one-sided conversation on mundane topics like the weather and the spring planting, she greeted the housekeeper's arrival with some relief.
Mrs. Jones, Mr. Poe is our guest. Is the blue room ready for him?
When she received an answer in the affirmative, Marjorie stood with alacrity and made for the door.
If you'll follow me, Mr. Poe, Mrs. Jones and I will show you to your room.
Mrs. Royse, once Mr. Poe is settled in, I wish to speak with you.
As you wish, Mr. Royse,
Marjorie replied, closing the door behind her and leaving her husband alone with the inquisitor. Mrs. Jones led the way, her house keys clinking in a way that Marjorie always found reassuring. As they went, the kindly housekeeper detailed the current state of the blue room.
It had a good airing last week, so I've just had the girls bring in fresh linens and light the fire. I told them to leave the curtains closed until the room warms up a bit, and I've got the kitchen heating water should Mr. Poe want a bath.
Mr. Poe looked startled at the idea, and Marjorie realized with a jolt that this strange man was of such a lower class that it had likely been some time since he bathed. Scrutinizing him from the corner of her eye, she took in his appearance as she had not done before. The fine coat hanging from his shoulders did not fit him, and she thought it must be the inquisitor's, for the shirt and trousers he wore beneath were of an inferior cut and quality. The sling that cradled his arm increased her puzzlement, as it appeared to have been hastily fashioned from a woman's plain shawl. He had a flighty, almost furtive air about him, as if, at any moment, he might bolt into the woods like a frightened rabbit. They had nearly reached the blue room, and Mrs. Jones was asking if Mr. Poe would like a tea tray sent up. Mr. Poe, who had resumed looking at his feet as soon as they left the study, confessed he had not eaten since midday yesterday.
Gracious, you must be half-starved. I will see that cook sends up a breakfast tray for you.
You are kind, ma'am.
Mrs. Jones opened the door of the blue room and stepped aside for Mr. Poe.
There is a wash basin over there if you want to freshen up. I'll send a footman to you as soon as we've hot water enough for your bath.
I hope you'll be comfortable here, Mr. Poe,
Marjorie added, remembering her place as hostess.
I am sure my husband has already told you that you may stay as long as you like. If there is anything you need, you have only to ask.
Mr. Poe once again thanked Marjorie for her kindness, and she and Mrs. Jones left him staring in awe at his luxurious quarters. They parted company in the hall, Mrs. Jones taking the servants' staircase to speak to cook in the kitchens, and Marjorie taking the grand staircase to return to Gregory's study. As she approached the door, which Mr. Hammond had left ajar on his recent departure, she overheard Mr. Jones saying,
I have my concerns, but I will, of course, do whatever you think best, sir.
Marjorie tapped lightly on the door to announce her presence.
Come in, my dear,
Gregory said.
Our guest is getting settled. He'll need a few things since he has no luggage. Mr. Jones, do you think you could contrive to get his measurements?
Marjorie said, as she sat at her little desk in the corner and opened the drawer for a sheet of paper.
I'll see Mr. Poe gets a proper wardrobe, madame.
Marjorie opened her mouth to thank him, then closed it again, frowning.
Mr. Royse, did you remove anything from my desk? She inquired, looking at her husband with a modicum of concern.
No, why do you ask?
My letter opener is missing. I always keep it right here.
Gregory furrowed his brow a moment before responding.
I can only presume Mr. Poe has it.
Mr. Poe!
Marjorie exclaimed.
Why should he have it?
I shall go to him and demand he return it.
Said Mr. Jones with an air of disdain and superiority.
I will make sure he knows thievery will not be tolerated in this house.
That will not be necessary, Mr. Jones,
Gregory said, waving his hand dismissively.
Do you have a particular attachment to the tool, Mrs. Royse, or may we allow Mr. Poe to keep it?
It has little value, sentimental or otherwise. It is just a letter opener.
Let Mr. Poe keep it then. Perhaps it will give him peace during this arduous time.
Peace? How could a letter opener give him peace?
He may think to use it as a weapon. It may bring him comfort to think he can protect himself should the need arise. Let him keep it.
Mr. Royse.
Mr. Jones spoke up.
I dare not contradict you, sir, but are you sure allowing him a weapon, even one so slight as a letter opener, is such a good idea?
Fear not, Mr. Jones. All will be well.
Mr. Jones disagreed, but he held his peace.
Will there be anything else, Mr. Royse?
Mr. Jones asked. The butler did not voice his disapprobation of his master's decision to bring Mr. Poe under his protection, but it was so clear in his stiffness of manner that even Marjorie could sense it.
No, that is all. You are dismissed.
Mr. Jones turned and left the study, closing the door behind him.
Come, sit, my dear. I have much to tell you.
Gregory indicated to the chair nearer him, and Marjorie moved from her desk to seat herself closer to her husband. Marjorie listened intently while Gregory explained Mr. Poe's presence. The gravity of the situation was not lost on her, though her husband told her there was little cause for concern.
Do you think having him here is such a good idea?
Marjorie asked the questions Mr. Jones had not voiced.
What we think is irrelevant.
I beg to differ,
Marjorie interrupted.
Shaleslip is our home, and the people who live and work on the estate or at the manor are under your protection. To bring a man in Mr. Poe's position into our home puts us and the staff at risk.
Marjorie's voice shook with slight tremors of fear, which a woman of her courage was not used to experiencing.
Marjorie, please try to understand. It is our duty to protect Mr. Poe.
Duty or not, I do not trust him. And what of the men who are after him? Would you have murderers coming to Shaleslip?
I do not want murderers coming to Shaleslip any more than you do, but I think you are overreacting. Mr. Hammond says the men after Mr. Poe think he is dead. No one knows he is here. As long as no one at Shaleslip reveals his presence, there should be no cause for concern. I do not ask you to trust him. I only ask that you support my decision to protect him.
Gregory went to his wife and pulled her into his embrace.
I promise to take every precaution to ensure the safety of you, Shaleslip Manor, and the staff.
And you, be sure you take care of yourself. Promise me you will.
Marjorie leaned back so she could look directly into his eyes.
I will. Nothing bad will happen to anyone, including me.
Marjorie shivered as a chill of foreboding crept down her spine. Chapter 3. Marjorie Royse stood at the drawing-room window with her arms wrapped tightly around her middle, forming a barrier between her and the harrowing world beyond. Standing in the warm sunlight, she was not relishing in her favourite view of Shaleslip Pond, but rather was absently inspecting her reflection in the glass while mulling over 100 worst-case scenarios. Mr. Poe had been in the house for a full 4 hours, and catastrophe had yet to strike, but that did not lessen her nerves. Marjorie could not shake the ominous feeling that tragedy was on the horizon. She closed her eyes, bowed her head, and said a silent, fervent prayer.
Dear Lord my God, protect us from the evil that lurks in shadows and guide our steps in your sight.
Marjorie, are you well?
Marjorie shook with a little start upon hearing his voice. She opened her eyes and looked up into the kind and caring face of her husband as he came near and placed his comforting hand on the small of her back.
Gregory, I am so scared,
she admitted.
Something will happen, I know it.
Gregory pulled her into his arms and said in a calm and comforting voice,
There is nothing to fear. Give it a day or two, and I wager we will forget Mr. Poe is even here.
Hardly,
Marjorie said, as she stepped out of his embrace. He frowned slightly, but did not pressure her, for he well understood her fears. In truth, he had the same fears, but refused to voice them and frighten her further.
It is time for my meeting with Mr. Baxter. Are you ready to accompany me?
I thought you would cancel the appointment given the situation,
Marjorie said, unable to hide her anxiety.
Estate business cannot be put on hold because of an unexpected house guest.
Even one who has been marked for death,
she whispered, her gaze darting to the door to make sure they were not overheard.
Dearest, you are worrying yourself over nothing. Consider the house is full of servants who would give their lives to protect you. You will be safe.
I am hardly concerned for myself. The staff should not have to risk their lives for my sake. Your decision to take in Mr. Poe has jeopardized the safety of the entire household, likely the whole of the estate, and possibly all of Shalebury.
Marjorie once again wrapped her arms around her middle, rejecting his gentle assurances.
Now hold on. Marjorie, you do not understand. It is my duty as a landowner to accept any request from His Majesty's servants in the law. My father taught me, as his father taught him, that I must always do my duty to the king and country. A Royse always does his duty.
I understand, Gregory. I simply do not agree in this instance. My father always does his duty also, but he taught me duty on another level. I do not believe in putting your duty to the king and country above your duty to God and family. It is your responsibility to protect what God has given you. You are not doing your duty when you place the manor, the staff, the local residents, and me in danger.
Tears stung her eyes, and her nose itched from the emotions she desperately held in check.
Forgive me, I cannot go with you to see the Baxters. I will send the basket with a maid. Please make my apologies.
Having said her piece, Marjorie rushed past her husband and went to her rooms. She knew he was passionate about duty, honor, and responsibility. She had known it before she knew much of anything else about him. To own the truth, they were the qualities that initially drew her attention. He was a man of honor, much talked about for his integrity with all classes of society, elite and other. She, a woman whose father acknowledged her intelligence and innate ability to fetter out solutions to complex tenant disputes, had been allowed, nay, even sought as an estate confidant. She had been privy to all of Elmgrove's dealings since the tender age of 15, and had been impressed by her overhearings about Mr. Royse as she became acquainted with him. As the two grew fonder of one another, she knew he noticed her abilities, and now that they were married, she rejoiced he recognized her contributions to Shaleslip, and hoped he would further seek her opinion of weightier estate matters in the future. Today was a perfect example of her dearest wish being fulfilled. She just hoped her outspoken and opposing opinions did not ruin her future chances of offering her contributions to the estate. She could not agree with Gregory now, not when his decision endangered everyone. It distressed Marjorie to disagree with Gregory's decision. With her passionate nature and bold opinions, she had always known it was inevitable that they would have disagreements. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that it would not be so early in their marriage. Marjorie allowed herself to wallow in her fears for a further 10 minutes before she shook herself out of her stupor and sat on the edge of the bed. She put her hands to her cheeks and tried to gather her composure. It would not do to allow herself to be overcome. She was the mistress of the manor. Mr. Poe was already here, and there was nothing she could do but make the most of the present situation.
Come in,
Marjorie said, in answer to a soft knock upon the door. Mrs. Jones entered with a tea service laid out on an elegant tea cart.
Some tea, madam.
How did you know?
Marjorie said with as much composure as she could muster.
It's been a stressful morning for you. A cup of tea will help calm your nerves.
Mrs. Jones pushed the cart to the little table under the window and prepared Marjorie's tea just how she liked it.
Did Mr. Royse send you?
Marjorie asked as she sat at the table. The view was not as wild and natural as the one from the drawing room, but the elegantly crafted gardens below and Mam Tor in the distance appealed to her on a different level.
No, madam, I just followed my intuition.
You are a godsend, Mrs. Jones. Will you join me?
If you wish.
Mrs. Jones prepared a second cup and sat in the chair opposite Marjorie to enjoy the few minutes of relaxation offered her.
May I ask you something?
Marjorie asked, after taking a sip of her tea.
Anything.
The housekeeper responded.
Does Mr. Royse often receive requests from the local inquisitors to house persons in Mr. Poe's situation?
No, this is the first time.
Marjorie's relief was great upon hearing the housekeeper's pronouncement. She took another sip of her tea, refraining from airing her views on the subject. It would not do for the staff to know she was not in favour of Mr. Royce's decision. She must be seen to respect and support him in everything, or else she risked the house falling into turmoil, much the same as Elm Grove had under her mother's negligent care. Marjorie would not allow that to happen at Shaleslip Manor.
We found suitable clothes for our guest. I took them up to him already. Mr. Jones and a footman are assisting him in the bath now. The poor man cannot scrub himself with his injuries.
Thank you, Mrs. Jones,
Marjorie said, colouring slightly at the housekeeper's frankness.
I am sure Mr. Poe is grateful for your kindness.
He said as much.
I am glad to hear he is educated enough in proper manners.
He is at that, madam, but that's no surprise to me. I knew his mother, you see.
Oh, was her family Shaleslip folk?
If that was the case, Marjorie thought it might explain her husband's stubbornness.
Not as such, no. That was 30 years ago, back before I went into service. Mr. Poe's mother and I both grew up in Shelbury. Her family's all gone now, but I remember them.
Mrs. Jones took a sip of her tea and then continued.
She was a genteel girl, very sweet and obliging. She married a Masson man, and he whisked her away. I never saw her again, but I would know her boy anywhere. That man upstairs is the spitting image of his mother.
Marjorie and Mrs. Jones sat silently, sipping their tea a moment longer, and then Mrs. Jones continued.
Mr. Jones and I spoke to the staff because a few saw Mr. Poe arrive, and rumours, mostly false I might add, were beginning to spread. Those false rumours play to our advantage, though.
Mrs. Jones took another sip of her tea, and Mrs. Royse raised an eyebrow. She continued.
One of the younger and, dare I admit, sillier maids declared he'd been shot fleeing the authorities for poaching before being brought before the master for his punishment. Before I could gather my wits and refute her statement, one of the lower footmen declared, "Aye, makes sense, for the master does not look kindly upon poachers." I was just collecting my response as another maid further declared, "What a kind master we have for taking him in and caring for his wounds until such a time they can properly carry out his punishment."
Marjorie was now sitting in shock, her teacup raised almost to her mouth as she considered the unlikely tale being told to her.
"Ma'am, we intend to allow the ruse. It will keep almost everyone away from our guest. No one but the four of us understands the truth or seriousness of the situation. Mr. Jones himself told Mr. Royse what I just told you, and he agrees. We all believe that not disclosing the truth diminishes the risk of the servant spreading gossip."
Thank you, Mrs. Jones. You and your husband have thought of everything. I appreciate your cleverness in dealing with the servants.
For the next 2 hours, Marjorie kept herself busy by writing a letter to her sister Joanna and then tried to apply herself to her needlework. Her heart was not in embroidery, though, and she was forced to set it aside or risk repeated injury to her fingers. Bent disconsolately over her sewing box, Marjorie pondered her words from earlier. She had spoken to Gregory in fear and now regretted what she had said. Marjorie closed her eyes and berated herself for her thoughtlessness. It was not becoming of a wife and lady. Had anyone heard her, they would question her loyalty to her husband and Shaleslip. She could not have that.
Pardon me, madam. You asked to be notified when Mr. Royse returned.
A footman said from the open door of the sitting room.
He is in the study.
Thank you,
Marjorie said. She imagined cramming her fears into her sewing box and shutting the lid with a snap. Then she gathered her resolve and went to Gregory's study.
Gregory, may I speak with you?
Marjorie asked, shyly poking her head around the open door.
Of course. Come in.
Gregory set aside his account books and turned his full attention to his lovely wife. Tentatively, Marjorie entered the room, fingers clasped behind her back.
I am sorry for my behaviour earlier today. I should not have questioned your decision or authority. Please know I support you in whatever choices you make regarding Shaleslip Manor, the estate, and our family.
Come here,
Gregory gently said as he held out his hand to her. Marjorie took his proffered hand and came to his side as he pushed his chair away from the desk. She thought he intended to stand, but he pulled her onto his lap and wrapped his arms around her. She nestled against him, tucking her nose against his neck, and deeply breathed in the familiar scent of his sandalwood soap.
You are forgiven. I love you, Marjorie. I would do nothing to put you in danger, but I understand your fears. If you feel being here while Mr. Poe is in residence is too risky, you could go to London and stay in the townhouse. I cannot go with you, and I would not like having you away from me, but I do not want you afraid in your own home.
It is very kind of you to think of my feelings, but I prefer to stay with you.
Gregory tightened his grip and pressed his lips to her hair above her ear.
I hoped you would say that. I promise you will be safe. I will see to it.
After comforting one another for a time, Marjorie explained the precautions Mr. and Mrs. Jones had taken to ensure Mr. Poe's anonymity. Gregory, too, had heard the tale from Mr. Jones and was quite pleased with the results and approved their precautions. Only one additional action was presently needed for their little subterfuge to be complete. The entire household was called to the servants' dining room so that he might address them.
It has come to my attention that poachers are on the estate. The authorities have approached me and are taking action with my permission. Their actions could take some time and, as you are likely all aware, have resulted in one man being injured. Presently I request, nay demand, that the maids not leave the confines of the manor without a footman to accompany them. No visitors will be allowed beyond the estate borders unless they have received express permission from me or Mr. Jones.
Every precaution he could think of was implemented for the entire household's safety. Upon conclusion of the address, Gregory asked Mr. Jones and the footman to follow him upstairs to his study.
Close the door, Mr. Jones,
Gregory said, going to the cabinet behind his desk. Mr. Jones did as requested, and then took his place at the head of the footmen.
Are all of you familiar with how to use one of these?
Gregory withdrew pistols from the cabinet and laid them upon his desk, taking care that the barrels faced away from those gathered. When he turned around, 11 sets of wide eyes stared back at him.
If you have never used one, tell me now, for I will not have a pistol in the hands of an amateur.
The men remained silent.
Good.
Gregory handed each man a weapon.
Conceal these on your person at all times. Have them with you when you escort the women outside, but don't brandish them in front of the ladies unless you are called on to protect them. I will not have you upsetting their delicate sensibilities or trying to impress them with bravado. If I hear you have done such, I will relieve you of the pistol, return it to the cabinet, and you risk your present position. Am I understood?
Yes, sir.
Came the chorus of responses as the men concealed the pistols inside their livery jackets. After a few more instructions, the footmen returned to their duties while Mr. Jones remained behind. If a maid or two wondered what the oddly shaped protrusion on the footmen's persons were, they wisely held their tongues.
Mr. Royse, I wanted to speak with you concerning Mr. Poe's wounds.
How bad are they? Mr. Hammond led me to believe his wounds are extensive.
Honestly, sir, the man's blessed lucky. A shotgun grazed him and nearly tore his shoulder to pieces. Whoever tended him was no surgeon, but they doctored him decently enough. At least they knew to remove the buckshot and cauterize the worst wounds. We will need to keep a sharp eye out for infection. That's the biggest danger now. I thought perhaps you could ask Mr. Hammond what he would have us do should Mr. Poe need a doctor.
I shall write to him directly.
Mr. Jones hesitated and continued.
I do not trust this Mr. Poe. He is hiding something. I am certain of it.
Are you sure you are not overreacting? Vicious men want him dead. He was shot, and he is no doubt worried about his wife. Perhaps we should give him the benefit of the doubt.
Very well, sir, but I still plan to keep a close eye on him.
I appreciate your diligence. Please keep me informed of everything relating to our guest.
Mr. Jones bowed and then left Mr. Royse alone to ponder the day's strange events. When Gregory entered Marjorie's chambers that night, he found her sitting by the window in the near dark. Any master could have painted her thus, sitting half in shadow, looking out at the darkness beyond her window. The only light in the room was the fire in the grate. It illuminated the folds of her dressing robe. Her head was bowed, her forehead pressed against the window frame, and her hands folded in her lap. Her expression, tight-lipped and sad, tugged at his heart. It pained him to see Marjorie looking so disconsolate. Her carefree nature and zest for life were contagious, and there were few times when Gregory had seen her without a smile. Now, however, her smile was gone. The red tip of her nose and the puffiness under her eyes revealed her failed attempt to stem another tide of tears. Gregory noticed the vase full of tulips Marjorie had picked that morning sitting in the center of the little table by the window. It seemed like an eternity ago when he had stood and admired her as she gathered the fragrant flowers. The day that had begun so promisingly had rapidly deteriorated after breakfast.
Let me help you to bed,
Gregory said, laying a comforting hand on her shoulder. She turned her head away from the window and kissed the back of his hand.
I cannot sleep. My mind is in far too much turmoil.
Gregory loathed to see Marjorie in this restless state of anxiety, caught up in dwelling on events outside her control. She worried for nothing.
Come lie down. I will rub your back to help you relax.
He coaxed her away from the window, helped her remove her dressing gown, and turned down the blankets so she could climb beneath their warm folds. Then he prepared himself and climbed in beside her, drawing her close. Marjorie nestled into the crook of his arm, half draping herself over him, and gladly accepted his loving ministrations. His hands were warm against her chilled skin, and the sheer comfort of his physical presence soothed her troubled spirit. Even so, fully half an hour went by before her steady breathing indicated she was at last asleep. Gregory lay awake for some time after. He would never confess it to his wife, but the possible consequences of Mr. Poe's presence in the house weighed just as heavily on his mind as on hers. They knew so little of the man. Though he truly did not fear attack from the outside, the theft of the letter opener and Mr. Jones's suspicion had caused him no little concern. He was duty-bound to protect Mr. Poe from discovery. He only hoped it would not become necessary to protect his household from Mr. Poe. With this in mind, he resolved to learn more about him on the morrow. Chapter 4. The brilliant moon broke through the clouds as it reached its zenith, filling Masson Cemetery with an eerie luminescence. 2 men wielding shovels were engaged in the arduous task of digging up a recently disturbed patch of earth, while a third stood watch nearby. The grave that had initially taken 4 men half the day to dig was emptied again in a fraction of the time. When the cheap pine casket of Mr. Poe was unearthed, one man used the blade of his shovel to pry open the lid, holding a precautionary handkerchief over his nose and mouth.
Tell me what you see.
Joseph Barnes, Lord Sharpson's foreman, shifted nervously from foot to foot. Over the years, his employer had given him any number of odious tasks, all of which he had executed without turning a hair. Grave robbing, however, seemed a bit low, even to him.
Is there a body? Is it him?
It's too dark.
The man said in a muffled grumble.
I can't see a blessed thing. Light the lantern.
Don't be daft, we can't be seen. Reach in with your hands and check for a body.
You do it.
The first man whispered to his companion.
I ain't touching a dead body.
Well, neither am I.
Barnes rolled his eyes and brandished his shotgun.
One of you better do it now, or this grave will have extra occupants when I leave.
The first man plucked up his courage and reached tentatively into the casket. He felt around for a moment, then removed his handkerchief and gave an experimental sniff.
He ain't here. The coffin's full of sandbags.
Barnes swore.
Where the hell is he then?
I'll just climb in and look for a forwarding address, shall I?
Don't tempt me, you imbecile. Get out of there and fill it back up. We don't want Hammond to know we were here.
The men slid the lid back in place and threw their shovels onto the dirt pile before hoisting themselves out. Barnes thought furiously while they worked to refill the grave. He needed to salvage this situation, or Lord Sharpson would have his head.
Poe is still alive. He couldn't have got far on his own, but if Hammond's involved, he could be anywhere. I want men searching every inn and post station in Derbyshire.
One man paused in his shoveling and looked at the foreman as if he had gone mad.
What, all of them? Do you know how many inns and post stations there are in Derbyshire?
You'll be able to tell me when you're through searching them all. What about his wife? Is Knox still watching her?
Far as I know.
Good. If Poe is alive, he's just stupid enough to contact his missus. We can use her.
Barnes gripped his shotgun tighter and headed for his horse, hitched at the cemetery gate.
We can use her,
he repeated grimly. Gregory rose at first light. He had slept poorly, worrying over Marjorie's well-being. His first concern was to her, despite his professions of duty to king and country, and he regretted the necessity of putting her in such a difficult position. She was young and inexperienced, still learning her duties as a wife and mistress of a large estate, and her mettle was being sorely tested. It was a baptism of fire, so to speak. Not wanting to wake her, Gregory silently rose and crept to his dressing room. His valet, who seemed to have a sixth sense regarding when his master would need him, was ready with a fresh set of clothes. Dressed and groomed, Gregory set out on a roundabout route to his study through the halls of his beloved home. Gregory Royse was exceedingly proud of Shaleslip Manor's great beauty. The manor construction was begun by his third great-grandfather, Mr. George Royse, in the English Baroque style, which was newly becoming popular at the time, a mere 2 years after the Great Fire of London. The London fire had devastated nearly every family in London, possibly all of England, whether their home or business had burned or not. The Royses had been no exception. Though their house in town and belongings were untouched by flame, the soot, smoke, and stench were so horrific they had opted to sell their London residence rather than return to it. The Mr. Royse of the days of the London fire had a friend and business acquaintance who had lost everything and desperately needed lodgings for his rather large family. Rather than stay in the ruined and desolate city, The Royses had sold their London residence to him for what pittance he could scrounge up, and they retreated to their ancestral home, set in the shadows of Mam Tor in Derbyshire. The ancestral home of the time had been a moderate house constructed using the influences of Renaissance architecture. The Royses of the 16th century had been wealthy enough to afford a grand house and all of the beauty and detail they should have included, but they had not the patience. Thus, the original house had been built in haste and was not the showpiece it should have been, considering the family's influence in Derbyshire. With so many families fleeing London and paid work being scarce, it was the perfect time to build a manor fit for their station in life. Great attention to detail, every available labourer from London to Shalebury, and a mere 3 years of patience had gone into the present manor's construction, and each subsequent generation of Royses for the past 5 generations had made improvements and kept the estate in pristine repair. Gregory Royse was no exception. Shaleslip Manor was one of the grandest homes in England, possibly the whole of Europe. Gregory rounded a corner and came upon Mr. Poe, who was moving down the corridor from the guest wing with the slow, stiff gait of a convalescent.
Good morning, Mr. Poe. I hope you are well.
Gregory said as he approached the man.
Well enough, thank you, sir. I thought a little exercise would do me good, and I figured I wouldn't be in anyone's way this early in the morning. I hope that is all right.
Of course. Would you like a tour of the house so you can find your way around while you are here with us?
Mr. Poe readily agreed, and they set off leisurely, Gregory stopping to point out works of art or architectural features whenever he saw the injured man needed rest. The abbreviated tour of Shaleslip Manor's principal rooms concluded in the library, where Gregory invited Mr. Poe to join him.
It will be another hour before breakfast is served, but I will call for tea and coffee. Would you like some?
If it pleases you, sir.
It does.
Gregory rang the bell and gave the order, then sat on his favourite leather lounger and returned his attention to his guest. He narrowed his eyes thoughtfully, watching Mr. Poe, studying him as a Cambridge scholar studies an obscure text. Mr. Poe fidgeted in his seat, unsure of what to say or do under such scrutiny.
You look like a happy man,
he said at last, unable to stand the silence any longer.
I suppose I am.
You should be. What with all your riches and this fine house?
Riches and a fine house do not make a man happy. A man chooses whether or not he will be happy.
Maybe so, but I'm sure it helps to be rich. To not have to worry where your next meal will come from.
Is that a frequent concern of yours?
You know, I came from a place like this.
Mr. Poe said, evading the question.
Perhaps not as grand, but similar nonetheless.
Why are you not there now?
Mr. Poe studied his hands, his expression darkening. He was spared from having to answer immediately by a maid entering with the coffee. Once the coffee was served, Mr. Poe began his tale.
I was disinherited.
He admitted in such a quiet voice that Gregory barely heard him.
Not for anything I did, mind you. My mother died when I was still in dresses, and my father remarried not long after. He doted on his new wife, and when she bore him another son, he sent me away and made her son his heir to please her. I was raised in Shalebury by Mrs. Tram, my mother's former nurse.
Shalebury!
Gregory said with some surprise.
It is a wonder we have never met before now, for Shalebury is but 5 miles from here, and I knew Mrs. Tram well.
No, sir, you would not have known me. I am 2 years your senior, and was already working in the LED mines while you were still playing in the fields with Peter Bolton.
Gregory flinched ever so slightly at the mention of his former childhood friend, but Mr. Poe failed to notice and continued without pause.
I have no memory of my real mother, and Mrs. Tram was the closest to family I had. She did her best by me, and I hope I have not disappointed her too terribly. God rest her soul. I wish she could have met my Martha. They would have got on famously.
Gregory sipped his coffee, noting with approval how affectionately Mr. Poe spoke of his wife.
Have you any children?
The good Lord has not seen fit to bless our own with children. 'Tis for the best, I suppose. Martha and I have enough trouble keeping a roof over our heads and putting food on the table. If there were any more mouths to feed.
Their conversation lulled for a time, with Mr. Poe staring morosely into his cup until Gregory said,
It takes a lot of courage what you are doing.
Poe sipped his coffee and avoided looking at Gregory, who was still studying him.
You're taking a bigger risk than me.
Why do you say that?
You could lose all this if Lord Sharpson is not convicted.
Poe's gesture took in the room, furnishings, and house.
His lordship is a vindictive man. If he discovers your part in this, perhaps I shouldn't have spoken. You may change your mind and send me away without protection.
I will not send you away.
Perhaps not, but I would wager you regret taking me in.
No, I do not regret doing my duty.
Poe looked at him over the top of his coffee cup, a derisive sneer curling his lips.
You think me naive.
Poe said nothing.
You may be as snide and disparaging as you wish, but I promise you are safe so long as you remain in the house and do nothing foolish.
Gregory set his cup aside and stood.
Now, if you will excuse me, Mrs. Royse will be up soon and expecting me at breakfast. You may join us if you wish.
Gregory departed, leaving Poe alone with his thoughts, clutching the letter opener he had stolen and which he now carried hidden in his sling. He wholly rejected the notion of being safe at Shaleslip Manor. He had not felt safe in a long time.
Martha, where have you been? Mrs. Hanks was fit to be tied when you didn't come to the laundry yesterday. The old bat said to tell you if you don't come back today, don't come back at all.
Martha heaved a weary sigh and opened her front door wider so her friend Mary could come in off the street. She had returned from Masson well after dark and endured a sleepless night, but no one cared about that. Certainly, Mrs. Hanks did not. Mary looked at her with concern.
What is the matter? Are you ill?
No, I am not ill,
Martha said, patting Mary's hand as she debated how much to tell her. Mary was a good creature, if a little vapid. She was also the biggest gossip for 20 miles, and whatever Martha said to her now would be known by the entire village come nightfall. There was no sense in lying, as Matthew's murder was sure to be in the papers, and so she sat at her table and recited the basic facts as she knew them.
Unscrupulous men murdered Matthew because he could not keep his head down and his nose out of trouble.
Murdered? How dreadful. Will they ever be caught, do you think?
Martha thought of Lord Sharpson, safe and untouchable in his opulent mansion. She shook her head in mute fury.
What about the funeral? When will it be?
It was yesterday in Masson.
Masson? Why there? They did not put him in the Poe family plot, did they? I thought his father disowned him.
The Inquisitor paid to have him buried in the parish cemetery. He felt responsible on account of not being able to keep my Matthew safe. It was all arranged before I even knew he was dead.
Oh, you poor soul! What will you do? Did Matthew leave you anything to live on?
Martha let loose a mirthless laugh that was nearly a sob.
Hardly a cent. We'd best get to the laundry before the old bat lets me go. I need the work now more than ever.
We'll walk there together,
Mary said. She waited while Martha closed and locked her front door, then looped her arm through Martha's and hastened towards the laundry, trying to cheer up her listless friend by relating all the gossip she had missed out on yesterday. Freddie Knox was secretly glad that Mr. Poe's grave in the Masson cemetery was empty, even though the news created a whole slew of problems for him. Lord Sharpson was furious. He had actually struck that bastard Barnes a physical blow. The livid bruise had given Freddie no little satisfaction when Barnes gave him his next task: use Mrs. Poe to discover the whereabouts of her husband. Freddie did not know as yet how he would accomplish this. It was evident from the woman's behavior that she thought her husband was dead. If she knew nothing, which he suspected was the case, he could only hope Poe was foolish enough to contact her. He scrutinized every man, woman, and child who walked down the Poe's street. Any of them could be a messenger or even Poe himself in some cases. When Mrs. Poe and her friend set off towards the laundry with arms linked, one sad and silent while the other chattered like a magpie, Freddie experienced a moment of indecision. Should he follow the woman or watch the house? If Poe sent a message to the house and Freddie could get his hands on it before the woman returned, he could save himself and her a lot of trouble. If she had received a message already and was simply putting on a good show, Freddie had to be there when she made her move. Cursing, he picked up a few wood blocks for whittling and followed. Chapter 5. Breakfast with Mr. Poe present was an altogether uncomfortable affair for Marjorie. The silence hung in the air like the suspended moment before falling china shatters on the ground. It was a gaping, unnatural void she yearned to fill with sounds, words, anything. It was not only the occupants of the breakfast room who were quiet, but the entire house and the grounds immediately surrounding it were eerily silent. Not even the birds of Shaleslip were inclined to voice their songs. Marjorie examined Gregory's face for any hint of discomfort, but he seemed not to be bothered by the silence, or perhaps he did not notice. She wished she could ignore it so easily. The silence offered no distraction from her worrying thoughts. She did not feel equal to engaging Mr. Poe in conversation, but she could not be so rude as to speak only to her husband, who did not seem inclined to speak at all. Hurried footsteps and a creaking door sent her heart racing as fast as if she had heard a gunshot. She chided herself for her foolishness when she saw it was only Mr. Jones with the Morning Post. He set the tray with the letters on the table and then retreated from the room without a word. Gregory glanced through the stack and handed a few to Marjorie, who pounced on them like a drowning woman grasps a lifeline.
Oh, a letter from my mother. I had best read it in private. Please excuse me.
Gregory nodded absently and continued to eat his meal as he sifted through the post. Marjorie took her letters to the comfort and solitude of the library. Never had she been so relieved for an excuse to leave the breakfast table. She had been near the breaking point, barely suppressing the hysterical urge to yell just to hear the air sliced around her. Shaleslip Manor's library had been Marjorie's favourite room from the moment she first saw it when she toured the house with her parents 2 months before her wedding. Upon her return to the house as Gregory's wife, she had taken every opportunity to enjoy it. She used the library nearly as often as she did her sitting room. The dark walls lined with shelf after shelf of leather-bound tomes called to her soul. Books could bring Marjorie out of her deepest gloom. Perhaps they could rescue her from today's stifling silence. The letter from her mother contained nothing of import, but it affected her nonetheless. For the first time since she had married Gregory Royse and come to live at Shaleslip Manor, she longed to return to Elm Grove and the security she had always felt there. She had never yearned for her mother's endless chattering before, but today she missed it bitterly. Though yesterday she told Gregory she would stay, her longing to return to Hertfordshire was growing with each passing minute. After a lifetime of security, she was unsure how to handle these feelings of fear and uncertainty. She wondered if her mother had ever felt this way. It would certainly explain the woman's nerves. Matthew Poe had never been a student of human behaviour, but that morning at breakfast, he made it a point to observe the Royses. Mrs. Royse was distressed by his presence. Nothing could be clearer. She fidgeted in her chair and shifted her uneaten food around her plate. She frequently looked to her husband for guidance, but he offered none, eating his breakfast in implacable silence, wholly engrossed in his newspaper. Mr. Royse was a man who maintained an unaffected attitude no matter the situation. Matthew knew his kind well, men who elevated stoicism to a fine art and put moral obligation and familial duty above all else. If the tittle-tattle he had heard from the servants was true, Mr. Royse was besotted with his pretty new wife. It may have been the case in the eyes of the servants, but he saw nothing of it. Mr. Royse hardly even looked at her throughout the meal and said barely a word when she took her letters and fled. Had he treated Martha that way, she would have slapped his face. Perhaps his fall from the gentry was not such a bad thing if this cold, lonely life was their lot. The thought of Martha filled him with sorrow. How he missed her. Since their marriage, they had never been away from one another for so long. It would all be worth it if his testimony condemned Sharpson and secured their futures. His clerk's salary had never been enough for them to live on, and it galled him that his wife was forced to work her fingers to the bone to keep them afloat. If his plan succeeded, she would never have to work another day in her life. Matthew quickly finished his breakfast after Mrs. Royse left. It occurred to him that the Royses' reticence was precipitated by his presence in the room. He determined to play the proper invalid in the future and eat in his rooms for the rest of his stay. The Royses had been so kind to him, he hated to interfere with the equanimity of their meals.
If you will excuse me, Mr. Royse, I will return to my rooms.
Gregory nodded, then stopped Mr. Poe before he quitted the room.
Do you read, Mr. Poe?
Yes, sir, when I get the chance.
The library is at your disposal. You may come and go there as you please.
Mr. Poe thanked him and went directly to the library. He stopped just inside the room, taking in the splendor. Earlier, when he had been there with Mr. Royse, there had not been time to admire the place or peruse the shelves as he desired. He was glad he had received permission to return. Books were his old friends, offering him comfort when everyone else had abandoned him. He inspected the nearest shelf, the way a child gazes at sweets, and removed a book to marvel at its pristine condition. Used as he was to the little Breckhill circulating library with its humble catalogue of 62 books, this room seemed a treasure trove of incalculable worth. As he fingered the bold lettering on the spine, he heard a woman clear her throat. Mrs. Royse sat on the sofa watching him.
Begging your pardon, ma'am, I did not see you there. Mr. Royse said I may borrow a book, but I will return later.
Matthew returned the book to its rightful place on the shelf and hastily retreated towards the door.
You may stay, Mr. Poe. I was just leaving.
Mrs. Royse stood and gathered her letters.
Are you sure? I would be happy to return later.
I am sure.
Mrs. Royse approached the door, but paused near Matthew before exiting.
I understand you must not leave the house, but if you care for exercise, the portrait gallery on the second floor is a fine place to walk. There is also the orangery, which can be found off the easternmost hall. It is lovely this time of year with the spring flowers in bloom.
Thank you, ma'am. The injury still takes its toll on me, and I get tired easily. Also, I would not want to get in anyone's way while I'm here, so I will keep to my rooms.
You will be in no one's way, but do as you will. If you should need anything, please ask.
Matthew bowed as Mrs. Royse turned and again made to leave the room. She was just crossing the threshold when he asked, Mrs. Royse?
Yes.
She paused with her hand on the doorframe.
Why did Mr. Royse take me in?
It was his duty. It had to be done.
Matthew did not respond, and Mrs. Royse turned and left the library. He despised people who did things merely to satisfy their sense of duty. Where would that leave him when Mr. Royse decided his duty had been fulfilled? Matthew knew it was only a matter of time before Lord Sharpson and his cohorts discovered where he was and came after him. Then Matthew would see Mr. Royse's true nature. The man would surely hand him over to save himself and his wife. No one would protect him. He was entirely on his own. Once again, He clutched the letter opener hidden in his sling. It was all he had. He would have to make do when the time came. On the surface, everything at Shaleslip Manor was in perfect order. Below the surface, the household was poised on a knife's edge. Everyone could feel it. There was trouble on the horizon, more trouble than poachers normally caused. The footmen had never been so vigilant in their duties. There was always one nearby, and if she had not known better, Marjorie would have thought Gregory had doubled their numbers. Their presence comforted Marjorie while at the same time making her painfully insecure about her desire for company. She had fled to the library that morning on instinct, only to find that the solitude was nearly as bad as the unnatural silence in the breakfast room. She had been on the point of rising from the sofa to summon Mrs. Jones on some pretext when Mr. Poe had opened the door and given her a fright which she was thankful he did not see. This behavior was particularly disturbing to Marjorie because, though she was a social person, she had always treasured her solitude. Whether it took the form of long walks or private study, seclusion was her method of escaping the pressures of society and replenishing her depleted spirits. Now she did not know where to turn for comfort. Trailed by an unobtrusive footman, Marjorie made her way to the gallery on the second floor, on her way to another part of the house. She paused beneath a few paintings, inspecting the faces of the Royses who had come before her husband, trying to pick out their matching features. The portrait of one George Royse, born almost 200 years ago, caught her attention. He sat upon his horse as if poised for battle. He looked very much like her husband, especially the serious expression on his face. It was the face of a man who knew his duty and performed it impeccably. Marjorie sighed and continued on her way, pausing again at one of the windows. The portrait gallery was on the same side of the house as the drawing room. Thus, she had a perfect view of Shaleslip Pond. It was a glorious sight, serene, calming, and inviting. Herons wandered in the shallows, dipping their heads in and out of the water. A family of wild ducks fed on the shore, the mother teaching her ducklings the best spots to find food. Marjorie wondered what went on beneath that calm surface. Was it as serene as it appeared from above, or did the murky depths teem with creatures in a desperate struggle for survival? She frowned and drew away from the window.
Life is what a person makes of it. While I could blame other people and events in my life for my failures, ultimately it comes down to me. The only person who can stand in my way is me.
She had placed limits on her capabilities and allowed fear to stand in her way of greatness. A great lady would have treated Mr. Poe with genuine warmth and kindness. A great lady would put aside her anxieties and go comfort Mrs. Baxter. She regretted how she had acted, but then a second realization came on the heels of the first. To live is to learn from our weaknesses and failures. Do not wallow in regret. Just move forward, and move forward she would. Marjorie gathered her newfound resolve and set forth to use it for greatness. She would be fearless. She would be strong. By God, she was a Royse. She would do her duty, and she would do it exceptionally. Gregory was reclining in the library, trying to lose himself in a book on the breeding and training of foxhounds. His jacket was off, discarded on the sofa, and his waistcoat unbuttoned. His cravat hung loosely around his neck. Marjorie entered the room and sat on the ottoman beside his slippered feet.
Gregory, have you ever wished to go back in time and change something you said or did?
He laid his book aside, turning his full attention to his lovely wife. She seemed a little more herself, which pleased him greatly.
I think everyone wishes that from time to time. However, if we could change our mistakes, we would never learn from them, and our lives would be very different indeed. Just think, if we had the power to change the past, we may never have met and married.
You always know just the right thing to say. You are right. I would have learned nothing had I not acted or spoken as I did.
May I ask what heinous deeds inspired these musings?
Perhaps it is more what I did not say or do. I should have been stronger and more supportive of you. I should have welcomed Mr. Poe into the house and offered him genuine kindness. That is all he needs right now. I should not have been so afraid that I refused to visit Mrs. Baxter.
You take too much upon yourself. What is done is done.
True, but I can make amends. I can be kinder to Mr. Poe. I can be stronger for the servants. And
what?
Gregory asked, noticing the gleam he loved so much returning to her glorious eyes.
2 days ago, you told me you were proud I took an interest in the lives of those under Shaleslip Manor's protection. Then, at the first test of my mettle, I failed you dismally. I want to rectify that as soon as possible. To that end, I want to visit Mrs. Baxter today.
Gregory took Marjorie's hand and pulled her onto his lap.
I am very pleased to hear it.
How pleased?
Marjorie asked, raising a single saucy eyebrow at him.
Allow me to demonstrate.
With the tips of his fingers under her chin, he guided her face towards his, barely brushing her lips with a kiss. Marjorie brought her hands to his chest and slipped them inside his waistcoat. She leaned closer, tempting him. Gregory obliged her with another kiss, much deeper and longer. She ran her hands up his chest and circled her arms around his neck, plunging her slender fingers into his hair, pulling him closer to her.
God, she is a passionate woman,
Gregory thought.
However did I convince her to marry me? I am nothing without her.
So preoccupied were they with one another that they did not notice when the library door opened and Mr. Poe entered. Neither did they notice him tiptoe a hasty retreat and quietly secure the door behind him, his face beet red. Chapter 6. Marjorie was true to her word and steadfast to her purpose. She paid her call on Mrs. Baxter, accompanied by no less than 2 footmen, which turned out to be a lovely visit, one that Marjorie could tell the woman sorely needed in this last month of her pregnancy. Upon her return to the house, Marjorie went out of her way to check on the staff, offering each maid and footman her sincere regard. She spent an hour at the piano in the music room, singing and playing Gregory's favorite melodies. Though he was not in the room with her, she knew he could hear her playing from the study, where he was tending to estate business. By supper time, Shaleslip Manor felt considerably calmer. The darkness had lifted, and the air felt lighter. It was a testament to Marjorie that she could be mistress of any situation if she exerted herself. Mr. Poe did not join the Royses for supper. Marjorie had not seen him since breakfast that morning. She was determined for Mr. Poe to know she did not resent his presence or wish him gone, but it would be difficult to tell him if he refused to leave his rooms. She requested a tray of sweets from the kitchen and asked Mrs. Jones to gather a few medical supplies and accompany her upstairs. She knocked upon the door of Mr. Poe's room and waited for an answer. She could hear rustling within the room, and then, a moment later, the door opened. Upon seeing her, Mr. Poe bowed awkwardly and said,
Good evening, Mum.
Good evening, Mr. Poe.
Marjorie responded cheerfully.
I'm sorry we missed you at supper. I trust a tray was brought up, and you found it to your liking.
Yes, ma'am.
Good. May I come in? I have brought you a choice of desserts. Has your wound been tended today?
Mr. Jones saw to it this morning.
Very good. I'm glad he is taking such good care of you. I hope you do not mind, but I will tend to you tonight.
Mr. Poe looked aghast at the idea.
That won't be necessary, Mum. I am sure the wound is fine.
That may well be the case, but it would ease my mind if you would allow me to tend it. Bandages should be changed at least twice a day.
Marjorie and Mrs. Jones good-naturedly bullied their way into the room, waving aside Mr. Poe's weak protests. Before he quite knew what was happening, he was seated in a chair, half shirtless, while the lady of the house in a shimmering evening gown unwound his bandages.
Really, Mum? I can wait for Mr. Jones or a footman to tend me. It is too much for a lady like yourself.
Mr. Poe protested.
Nonsense.
Marjorie scoffed as she gently bathed his shoulder with a soft washcloth.
You are my guest, Mr. Poe, and I always see personally to the needs of my guests. Now hold still while I apply the ointment. We mustn't let fever and infection set in.
Mr. Poe kept up a stream of protests, but Marjorie was having none of it. She and Mrs. Jones worked in concert with an almost ruthless proficiency. They were done in short order, and Marjorie said good night and left with a light step, buoyed by the satisfaction of a job well done. Mrs. Jones cleaned up the dirty bandages, leaving Mr. Poe with a variety of custards and tarts to choose from, and a drastically altered opinion of Mrs. Marjorie Royse. Chapter 7. It was just after 1 in the afternoon when Martha returned home for a brief rest and a bite to eat between shifts. Since the funeral 3 days ago, she had found that keeping to her usual routine offered the smallest bit of comfort and distraction from the gnawing emptiness inside. She filled her days with familiar tasks, surrounded by familiar faces, and found solace in working herself to exhaustion. Being alone at night was not so terrible when she was too tired to think or feel. She did not know how long she could stay numb this way, but she feared giving vent to her grief. She truly believed that if she lay down to cry as she wished to do, she would never find the strength to rise. Matthew would not wish that for her. He would wish her to move on and find happiness. For now, she would focus on simply moving. On her way out, she noticed a letter had been slid under the door. She picked it up and inspected it with a wary eye. Rarely did she or her husband receive letters. After all, they had no one to write to, and Matthew had always settled their debts right away. Martha had not laid eyes on a creditor's note in the whole of her married life. There was no return direction, and the writing on the front was not familiar. Standing near the window where the light was better, she cracked the wax seal. She read the first words on the page, and then she reread them. She let out a sob of relief and fell to her knees. He was alive. Her Matthew lived. With renewed spirits, Martha leapt to her feet and ran to her dresser. She pulled out the top drawer and threw it on the bed. Reaching to the back of the dresser, she felt for the folded paper held in place by a nail and removed it carefully. Then she laid the letter out on the table and unfolded the cipher her husband had created for her. At face value, the letter seemed to be little more than a loving husband's assurances that he lived and she should not despair, but no one else must know. Once she had deciphered it, however, the message read, "Shaleslip near Shalebury. Cover your trail." Martha knew what to do. She fetched her travel valise from beneath the bed and gathered everything of value she and Matthew owned. She folded Matthew's good winter coat and used it to line the bottom of the valise. Then in went a miniature portrait of the late Mrs. Poe, with a lock of her hair set in the silver frame, a pair of brass candlesticks that had been Martha's grandmother's, and a small mantel clock that had been a wedding gift from Mrs. Tram. She carefully wrapped the objects in her best shawl and petticoat and covered them with as many articles of hers and Matthew's clothing as she could fit. She slipped a spare skirt on under the one she wore and wrapped an extra shawl around her shoulders. Then she removed an old coin purse from its hiding place behind a loose brick in the hearth, wrapped a heel of bread and 2 wrinkly apples in a handkerchief, and surveyed her small home for what she thought might be the last time. With a satisfied nod, she closed the shutters and locked the door behind her. Martha had to shield her eyes from the bright afternoon sun as she raced towards the Breckhill ticket office. She knew the last post-coach north would leave at 4:15, and she wanted to ensure she had a place on it. Out of the corner of her eye, She saw a slender man in a black coat keeping pace with her on the opposite side of the street. He looked oddly familiar, but she could not place him. She continued towards the post inn, pausing once or twice to wait for traffic to clear before crossing an intersection. Each time she stopped, she turned just enough to see if the man in the black coat was still there, but she did not see him. Still, something about him aroused her suspicion. Unfortunately, she had been too naive until now to realize the men who were after her husband might take an interest in her as well. How was she to get out of town without being followed? How was she to lose this man if he was indeed following her? As Martha made her way to the coaching station, she devised a plan. The place was busy this time of day, full of weekend travelers coming and going or just passing through. She glanced around as she stepped into the queue for the ticket counter and looked for familiar faces. She briefly made eye contact with a man in a grey jacket and blue waistcoat. He smiled at her, sending her already frazzled nerves into a frenzy. Was he following her too? To hide her nerves, Martha spoke to the ladies behind her in the queue, a nice woman and her charge, who were travelling to meet the girl's brother in Derby. After talking with them briefly, Martha's plan took a firmer shape. She purchased her ticket to Shalesbury and waited for her two new friends. Once all three had their tickets, she pointed to a bench near the Derby loading platform and asked the women if they would like to continue their conversation while they waited for their coaches. The women agreed, and Martha hoped her easy, friendly manner with them would make it appear as if she was travelling with them. To this end, she paid close attention to the conversation. But all the while, she was surreptitiously scanning every passenger in the queue or on the platforms. There was a man in a black coat who had the same bearing as the man on the street, but his back was to her, and she could not be certain it was him. 10 minutes went by before the call came for the passengers to gather for the coach to Derby. Martha and the two women stood and went to the platform edge. The man in the black coat also stood. The men riding up top with the bags were to board first, followed by those who would ride inside. Martha stood with the ladies, watching the man in the black coat. He stood with the other men, waiting to climb up top. His eyes turned away from her. His gaze never once fell upon her, even for a moment. He was unnaturally intent on studying the man's hat in front of him. Chills raced up and down Martha's spine. At last, it was his turn to climb aboard the coach. Once he was on the ladder, Martha bid farewell to the two women and sauntered away in what she hoped was a casual, unremarkable manner. She turned the corner out of sight, praying the man had not seen her and would assume she had got inside the coach. It was not until the coach rolled away from the inn that Martha breathed easy. She emerged from hiding just in time to board the coach going north to Shalesbury. The post-coach made the entire journey to Derby without stopping, for there was no other posting inn along the way, and a distance of 15 miles hardly warranted a change of horses. Freddie scanned the passengers as they disembarked, but Mrs. Poe was nowhere to be seen. The ladies she had been with were there, but she was not. He took stock of the luggage, noting that the passengers had collected every piece. Not a single valise remained.
Cursed be,
he muttered under his breath as he approached the ladies he had seen her with.
Excuse me, ladies, but was there not a third travelling with you?
He inquired.
No, sir. It's just the two of us.
The younger woman answered.
Oh, but I thought you had another friend. A woman in a wool coat and a blue skirt.
She wasn't with us. We only just met her.
Did she not come south to Derby on the coach?
The older woman frowned at him, her friendly gaze turning to suspicion.
No, she did not,
she said in an icy tone, putting a cautionary hand on her charge's arm.
She didn't say where she was heading.
And if she had, you wouldn't tell me, you crafty old bird,
Freddie thought.
Thank you,
he said as he backed away with a slight bow. He felt like kicking himself. How could a common village washerwoman have duped him? She had never even looked twice at him during the past weeks. Or so he had thought. Apparently, he was mistaken. She was more sharp-eyed and vigilant than he gave her credit for. His only option now was to return to Breckhill and question the ticket master. Freddie made his way to the ticket counter and was informed there would be no more coaches to Breckhill until tomorrow. Cursing his rotten luck, Freddie set out to find somewhere to spend the night. When Martha arrived in Shalebury, there was no sign of the man in the dark coat. She breathed a sigh of relief. She had lost him if, indeed, he had been following her. She picked up her valise and made her way into the inn. The sun was already setting, and stars appeared in the eastern sky. There was no sense in her trying to find Shaleslip Manor in the dark, especially as she had no idea how far it was or in what direction it lay. Chafing at the necessity of waiting for morning, she sought out the innkeeper to bargain for supper and a bed. The innkeeper set her to scrubbing pots in the kitchen, much to the delight of the cook, who was short a scullery maid and fuming over the increased workload. The errant maid had quit 2 days ago, giving no notice. Taking stock of the filthy pots, Martha thought it was no great loss, as the lass had not been doing a proper job anyhow. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, chatting amiably with the kitchen staff as she scrubbed. The cook was so pleased with her work that she offered her a job outright. Martha declined, a little regretfully, saying she was just passing through.
That's a shame.
The cook sighed.
Those pots never looked so clean, even when they were new. Where are you headed, if you don't mind my asking?
To an estate nearby,
Martha answered, trying to be vague.
Shaleslip Manor, then.
The cook stated more than asked. Martha nodded, mentally kicking herself. Of course the woman would know she meant Shaleslip Manor. It was not as if the neighbourhood had an excess of large estates.
Have you got a job out there?
I hope so, but I'm not for positive.
Ah, you'll have an interview with Mrs. Royse, then. She's very nice, affable even. I have met her myself. She stayed here once before she married Mr. Royse. A real fine lady she is. You have nothing to fear. I'm sure she will take you on. You can even send her to me for a reference.
She winked. Martha smiled.
Is Shaleslip Manor very far from here?
Not very far, only 5 miles. What time is your appointment?
She gestured to the serving maid, who was just sitting down with a cup of tea.
Lucy's brother works there. He could drive you in the morning if you don't mind getting up at the crack of dawn.
I would like that very much,
Martha replied, not bothering to answer the question about her meeting with Mrs. Royse.
I'm no stranger to the crack of dawn.
No, I thought not. You'll tell Charlie, won't you?
The cook asked, turning to the maid.
Of course. I'm sure he won't mind. He can pick you up when he drops me off. No trouble. And what was your name, miss?
Matilda Green,
Martha offered.
Pleased to meet you, Matilda. I'll see you in the morning.
The maid departed, leaving Martha feeling very pleased as she finished cleaning and sat down to a steaming bowl of the best stew she had ever tasted. After thanking the cook for the delicious meal, Martha went to bed. She had been given the errant scullery maid's pallet for the night. It was small but clean and close to the warmth of the hearth, and Martha collapsed gratefully upon it. Perhaps no more than 5 miles separated her from her husband, and once she reached him, they would never be separated again. She fell asleep with a slight smile on her lips. Chapter 8. Gregory, upon hearing Marjorie had taken it upon herself to nurse Mr. Poe back to health, was simultaneously piqued and proud. That she would take on such a task herself was almost unthinkable, but then again, he should know better than to presume. Marjorie was unique, unlike any other woman he had ever known. Nothing she did would ever surprise him again. Honestly, he was more proud of her than piqued. Gregory had heard the quiet hum of approval from the staff as she took charge during this time of uncertainty, and it pleased him to hear such approbation of his wife. Since that evening, Marjorie had checked on Mr. Poe twice a day. She even sat with him in the library once and discussed some of her favourite books. Mr. Poe had grown to trust her. and now that he was feeling much better and moving around without so much stiffness and pain, he attempted to know her husband better too. Last night, he had even taken supper in the dining room and then sat with the Royses in the drawing room for a half hour. It had been almost a week since Mr. Poe first came to Shaleslip Manor, and nothing untoward had happened. The Royses and the Shaleslip Manor staff were relaxing and settling back into their normal routine, and Mr. Poe was beginning to believe he would be safe. That morning, Marjorie and Gregory felt easy enough to venture out on one of their early rambles through the gardens before breakfast. Afterwards, Marjorie joined him in his study to write her letters. She had not yet returned the favour of her mother's letter, and it must be done soon, lest Mrs. Wells think her too ill to write or some other such fancy. Mrs. Wells was proud of Marjorie and her marriage to Mr. Royse, though it took her so very far away from Elm Grove, and wrote to her at least once a week. Marjorie had never imagined her mother would write so often. But then again, she had never imagined her mother would miss her as she did. Mrs. Wells took great delight in telling her the neighbourhood news and informing her of her father's comings and goings. Mr. Wells did not like to write, and even the promise of a response from his favourite daughter could not persuade him to do so. Without her mother, Marjorie would know nothing about him, save what he chose to share when he arrived unexpectedly on her doorstep. Marjorie had always been a favourite of her father, and accepted that she and her mother were very different. Since her marriage and removal to Derbyshire, everything had changed. The distance between them made Marjorie appreciate her mother more and lessened her silliness. Writing to Mrs. Wells was not a chore at all, but a pleasure. Half an hour later, she made her way into the music room, where Gregory soon joined her, taking pleasure in listening as she practiced on Gemma's pianoforte. Marjorie was just finishing an Italian ballad when Mrs. Jones came in.
Excuse me, ma'am, but did you advertise for a new maid?
No, I did not. Why do you ask?
There's a Matilda Green here to see you. She says she has an interview for a downstairs maid position.
How very strange. There must be some misunderstanding.
She is here now.
Gregory stood with haste from the settee he had reclined on to listen to his wife's lovely playing.
Should I send her away?
Mrs. Jones asked, slightly on edge from her master's hasty response. Marjorie exchanged puzzled glances with Gregory, who was now standing near her.
No, I will see her. Where is she now?
At the servants' entrance. I'll put her in my sitting room, ma'am.
Please do, and keep her there. I shall come down in a moment.
Mrs. Jones curtsied and withdrew while Marjorie put away her sheet music.
Why do you suppose she has come?
Marjorie asked Gregory.
It is most unusual, and why would she ask for me? Mrs. Jones screens all applicants when we put out an advertisement.
My dear, your questions bear no weight. The true question is, how did an unknown person gain entrance onto the estate property?
Oh,
Marjorie exclaimed, with not a little apprehension.
I had forgotten about that.
I will accompany you to meet this woman,
Gregory stated. When Marjorie hesitated, not because she did not want him to accompany her, but because of her concern of what was to come. He continued.
Under normal circumstances, confusion like this may be nothing, but these are not normal circumstances. We cannot be too careful when bringing new persons into the manor.
Yes, of course, you are right.
Gregory accompanied her downstairs to the housekeeper's sitting room, where Mrs. Jones kept a stern and suspicious eye on a pretty young woman who seemed to be wearing every article of clothing she owned. The woman, calling herself Matilda Green, scrambled to her feet and curtsied, clutching a bulging valise.
Good day, Miss Green,
Marjorie began.
Mrs. Jones informs me you believe you have an appointment with me for an interview. Do you have an advertisement or a letter from Shaleslip Manor requesting your presence?
No, ma'am,
Miss Green answered.
Do you have anything? Letters of recommendation or a list of your work experience?
No, ma'am.
She answered again.
I'm not here for a job.
No.
Marjorie eyed her warily. The woman steadfastly refused to make eye contact, squirming uncomfortably.
Then why are you here? Tell me, why did you come to Shaleslip Manor?
My husband?
The woman's voice faltered. She had just noticed Gregory's intent gaze upon her from where he remained just outside the door, looking in. Marjorie, now on edge, continued her patient questioning.
Your husband?
She questioned.
He sent you here. Why?
Because he is here.
Gregory said in a quiet way that meant he was angry. Very angry.
He did not send her. He sent for her, the fool.
Marjorie looked from him to the woman, fear pricking at the back of her neck. If this was Mrs. Poe, and she knew her husband was here, then someone else was sure to find out, and none of them were safe. Without another word, Gregory went to the door into the servants' quarters at the end of the slight hallway and jerked it open.
Bring Mr. Poe here,
he demanded in a thundering voice of a footman sitting at a small table reading his correspondence.
Immediately.
The footman gave a start and then rushed from the room, shoving the letter into his pocket, not daring to take the time to put it away properly. His thunderous voice and sharp commands had been clearly understood not only by the footman, but also by the ladies. The room was entirely silent for the few minutes it took for Mr. Poe to be fetched. As they waited, Marjorie stared in horror at Mrs. Poe, who in turn stared fixedly at the floor, half defiant and half fearful. Mr. Poe's face erupted into a genuine smile when he saw his wife. He hurried forward to reach her, but Gregory stepped in front of him, blocking his path.
What is this? No one was to know where you were. Why is your wife here?
I had to tell her. She is my wife.
How could you be so foolish? What if she was followed?
I think I was being watched, but I gave them the slip,
Mrs. Poe offered. She had dropped her valise and held her arms outstretched as if she would reach through Mr. Royse to touch her husband. Marjorie felt a sudden pang of sympathy for the woman.
How can you be sure you lost them?
Gregory's tone was hard and unrelenting, causing Mrs. Poe to back up and step behind Marjorie for protection.
If my wife said she lost them, then she lost them,
Mr. Poe said. His voice was stronger than it had been during the entirety of his stay.
You are a fool if you think that.
Gregory snapped, brushing past Mr. Poe and stepping into the hall.
Jones.
He bellowed at a volume fit to wake the dead. Marjorie followed him, glancing over her shoulder at the couple.
Mrs. Poe, you are welcome to stay while Mr. Royce determines what should be done. Mr. Poe can show you upstairs. If you will excuse me.
Her voice trailed off as she left the sitting room in pursuit of Gregory, who was barking orders as he stormed through the halls. When the Royces quit the housekeeper's sitting room, Matthew closed the distance to his wife, pulled her into a one-armed embrace, and kissed her.
I knew you would come,
he said, pressing his forehead to hers.
You did not doubt me, did you?
Of course not. But I feared the letter would not reach you, or you would not remember our cipher. In my mind, you were waylaid in 1,000 different ways. No matter. You are here now. Let's go to my room. I think we should stay there while Mr. Royce calms himself.
He is a fierce man, is he not?
I thought so at first, but he is not so fierce as he is determined. Mr. Royce carries great responsibility and is worried for the safety of everyone because of my presence here. But come, let us talk upstairs.
Matthew took his wife by the hand and led her upstairs to his room. Upon closing the door, he leaned against it with a sigh of relief.
I cannot tell you how relieved I am to have you here. I have worried for your safety every moment we were apart.
I think a man has been watching me,
Martha admitted.
So you said. Is it someone we know?
She shook her head.
I thought he was just a regular woodcarver. He set up a stall at the end of our street and sold toys. I never looked twice at him until I caught him following me to the posting inn. I gave him the slip before I boarded the coach for Shalebury. Why are men watching me if you are presumed dead?
Something must have given me away.
Matthew, I'm scared. There are 6 ruthless men out for your blood. Will we have to stay in hiding for the rest of our lives?
1.
Matthew responded.
1 what?
There is only 1 man after me. I struck a deal with the other 5.
What do you mean you struck a deal?
I plan to testify against Lord Sharpson, but the other 5 are paying me to clear their names.
Paying you?
Martha cocked her head and looked sidelong at him. She had never thought Matthew was the type to accept a bribe. She rather thought he had too much pride for that. The payment must be a vast sum to make him set aside his principles.
How much?
£10,000.
£10,000.
Martha repeated in a tone that conveyed her disappointment.
You would sell your integrity for so little.
£10,000 is no small sum, but you mistake me. They are paying me £10,000 each.
Martha gaped at him.
Matthew, I do not think this is a good idea. How can you be sure they will not kill you as soon as their names are cleared?
They will not do that. I trust them.
You are a fool, then.
She spat.
You cannot trust men of their ilk. These men are snakes, everyone, and they will turn on you.
It is worth the risk. Surely you can see that. Just think, Martha. £50,000. We can start our life over again, with all the money we will ever need.
I do not want a new life, not one bought and paid for by thieves and murderers.
You do not understand, my love. With this money.
Is money so important to you that you would risk your life and the lives of those protecting you? You risk my life too, by bringing me here. Is £50,000 worth my life? Is it?
Martha's angry response was the last thing Matthew expected from her. He could not answer her. He thought she would be happy he had struck a bargain to secure a better life for them. It was far too late now to discover the cost was too high. No one, man or woman, had ever given Freddie Knox the slip before yesterday. He should have been angry, but he rather admired Mrs. Poe for her ingenuity. Hell, he had not even realized she knew he was hanging around. Sitting atop the post coach back to Breckhill, he wondered how long she had known he was watching her. As soon as the coach rolled to a stop in Breckhill, Freddie practically leapt from the top and quickly made his way to the ticket counter, where the obliging ticketmaster remembered selling Mrs. Poe a ticket to Shalebury. He should have guessed it. Mr. Poe had grown up there, and may still have friends in the neighborhood willing to shelter him. Freddie cursed his carelessness and complacency. He should have gone to Shalebury in the first place. He had been a fool to presume he knew where she was going based on where she sat after purchasing her ticket. What an amateur blunder. It frustrated him to be so wrong about so much. After maintaining a perfect record for years, to slip twice was unthinkable. He attributed his carelessness to the fact that his heart was no longer in the job. Freddie shook his head, dismissing his gloomy thoughts. A man in his profession could not doubt himself. If he did, so would others. And then where would he be? Unemployed, that's where. He would just have to be more careful. He sent a curt message to Barnes and purchased a seat on the next coach to Shalebury. Lucky for him, he only had 3 hours to wait for the next coach. He was the last to board the coach's roof, wedging between a garrulous, portly man and an old sailor with one eye and tobacco so foul-smelling it stung Freddie's eyes. When the coach finally arrived in Shalebury, Freddie was the first one off the top again. He looked around to get his bearings and headed straight for the nearest inn. Inside, sitting in a darkened corner, were 2 of Lord Sharpson's hired dogs. He had been working with them for months now, but had never made any effort to get to know them. They were not the type of men who improved upon closer acquaintance. They were daft, unscrupulous men who enjoyed ruining people's lives. Men who enjoyed killing. men who killed other men for sport. Freddie wished he had never met the lot. Never, even in his years in the British Secret Service, had he met such despicable men, and that was saying something.
What do you know?
Freddie asked as he took a seat on the bench across from them. His back was to the room, which made him slightly uncomfortable.
No more than you do.
Said the first man, picking at his teeth with a knife.
Just got here. Don't even have a drink in our hands.
He spat a small piece of gristle he had picked from his teeth onto the floor and shouted at the barmaid. The second man grunted in agreement. He was not exactly a man of words and preferred to let his associate do the talking.
Poe's wife came through here yesterday. Did anyone see her?
No use in us asking around. You're the only one who knows what she looks like.
You know what Poe looks like. Have you asked about him?
Of course we did. Talked to two men sitting just outside the stables, chewing the fat. One of them says he members him, but that's about it. No one's seen him in years. You sure he's here?
He must be. Mrs. Poe would not have come here otherwise. Poe is close. I can feel it.
Freddie looked over his shoulder to survey the patrons and staff in the inn. His eyes fell on a young man in livery chatting amiably with a serving girl, several packages stamped with apothecary symbols stacked on the table in front of him. Freddie pushed back his chair and stood, straightening his coat.
If you will excuse me, gentlemen, it's time to go to work.
Chapter 9. Later that same day, Mr. Jones ushered a very contrite Charlie into Gregory's study. The young man had an alarming story to tell, which Mr. Jones coaxed out of him employing thunderous expression and a sharp jab to the ribs.
Begging your pardon, sir, but I've done something terrible,
Charlie began. Gregory frowned at the lad. A knot of dread formed in the pit of his stomach.
Go on.
Mr. Jones sent me to Shalebury to collect the post and buy some things for Mr. Poe at the apothecary shop. Since I was down that way, I thought I'd stop at the inn and see my sister. You see, sir, there's talk, and I wanted to warn her.
What kind of talk?
Mr. Royse questioned.
I was heading past the sweet shop on my return and paused to look in the window. Old man Barley passed behind me muttering about killings and swearing there ain't been no poachers round these parts for 5 years or more. Then I heard a man asking about Mr. Poe as I passed the livery. I'm no fool, Mr. Royse. I'm learning to better myself and keeping my ears open. Why Mr. Jones here, he's been teaching me that.
He attempted a hesitant smile at the butler, still clutching his jacket collar.
I know that is the name of the man here.
Charlie had paused in his story, and Mr. Jones gave him another shake, though slightly calmer than the last.
Hurry, boy, get to the point.
Yes, sir, Mr. Jones.
Charlie spoke as fast as his tongue would work.
While I was there, a stranger sat next to me and started asking questions, real friendly-like, too friendly. I told him to shove off and told Lucy not to speak to him, but he saw the things from the apothecary, and anyone in the village could have told him I'm a Shaleslip man. I'm sorry, sir. I should have come straight back. I never should have stopped to see Lucy. I've endangered us all, haven't I?
Charlie attempted to stand tall and strong, but Gregory and Mr. Jones noticed his lower lip quiver in his attempt not to display his youth by crying. Gregory closed his eyes for a moment, fighting to keep calm. He had been right to question whether they had followed Mrs. Poe. Apparently, she had not lost her pursuers as thoroughly as she had thought.
I will write to Mr. Hammond,
he declared, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper even as he spoke.
He must remove Mr. Poe to another location. Shaleslip is no longer safe.
He scrawled a brief note that only the Inquisitor would understand and sealed it.
Are you good with a horse, Charlie?
Yes, Mr. Royse.
Then here is your chance to redeem yourself. I want you to take the fastest horse in the stable and deliver this letter to Mr. Hammond in Derby. Do not stop for anything.
I won't let you down, sir. Not again.
See that you don't.
Mr. Royse produced a pouch of coins and sent Charlie on his way. Almost as soon as he was gone, Marjorie rushed into the study, white-faced, clutching a letter to her bosom.
Gregory!
She gasped.
Did you know Gemma is coming home?
Certainly not,
Gregory exclaimed.
I hired the London music master for the whole of the summer. The lessons were what she wanted.
She writes his father died and he returned to Italy to settle his estate. He won't return to London for some weeks. She says she will arrive tomorrow with Mrs. Miller.
Confound it. I do not want her here now. Given the latest developments, I do not want you here either. Do we have time to write and tell her to stay in London until we send for her?
No, I do not think so. She writes as if she expects to arrive on the heels of this letter.
Perhaps you should go to London. You could intercept her carriage along the way and return once it is safe here again.
Once it is safe? Is it not safe now?
I fear it is not. Young Charlie had an encounter with a suspicious character in Shalebury. I have reason to believe Mr. Poe's enemies know he is here.
Good Lord, what are we to do?
I sent word to Mr. Hammond to come for the Poes, but the earliest we can expect him is tomorrow night, or the morning after. All we can do is keep watch, wait, and see what happens.
Look,
Freddie said, pointing to the lad coming down the lane towards them on a magnificent horse. The boy, no more than a child, rode like the very hounds of hell nipped at his heels. Events had progressed rapidly since his arrival in Shalebury. Not 5 minutes after the liveried lad had streaked out of the inn like a scalded cat, Barnes had come in off the Derby coach and demanded a progress report. Horses had been procured in short order, and the 4 men had set out for Shaleslip Manor to scout the lay of the land.
Is it the same lad you saw at the inn?
Barnes asked.
Aye, that's him.
Stop him,
Barnes ordered.
I want to know where he's going in such a hurry.
We shouldn't show our hand so soon,
Freddie cautioned.
I'd say you already did that back at the inn.
Barnes snapped.
Now move. If he gets ahead of you on that beast, these nags will never catch him up.
Volo was the most expensive and fastest horse in the Shaleslip stable. Bred for fox hunting, he had a finer pedigree than many a lord in Parliament. Charlie had been given charge of his grooming some months ago, but he had never dreamed he would get the chance to take him out and test his limits. Under different circumstances, he would have enjoyed it immensely. Charlie's heart leapt into his throat and lodged there when he saw 4 men on horseback paused in the road just ahead of him. 3 of them kicked their horses and raced towards him. Volo startled and reared, but Charlie kept his seat and turned him off the road into the grassy field. The 3 horsemen were right on top of him, leaning close to grab hold of him. Among them, he recognized the stranger from the inn. Charlie pulled a boot from his stirrup and kicked out at the man on his left. He scored a lucky hit, and the man tumbled from the saddle. There were still 2 horsemen to deal with. They flanked him on either side, keeping pace. He urged Volo to go faster, though the beast needed no encouragement. Volo's blood was up, igniting his competitive spirit, and in a matter of seconds, he outpaced the other horses. Charlie steered him toward a stand of trees and gave him his head, leaning low over his neck. A pistol shot split the air behind him. Just as he reached the tree line, the bark on the tree to his right splintered with a second shot. Charlie allowed Volo to maintain his reckless pace, weaving with practiced ease through the trees towards the southern road on the other side as he clenched the beast's mane with both hands. One last shot came from behind, but Volo had outdistanced the riders, and Charlie, carried away by the excitement of the chase, did not see or feel the impact of the bullet in his arm.
Curse you fools!
Barnes shouted when the 3 men returned empty-handed.
That lad will have the constabulary on us before nightfall.
He weren't headed for the village,
one man pointed out.
Mayhap, we still got time.
Not enough, I'll warrant. Why didn't you shoot him down when you saw he was getting away?
You try shooting someone from the back of a galloping horse.
That's what Sharpson pays you for. Come with me. We need to get closer to the house and see if we can get at Poe.
It would be better to wait until the cover of night,
Freddie advised.
An estate that big, there must be upwards of 100 staff on the property. It will be impossible to get near the house unseen in the daylight.
All right, then. I'll send to Lord Sharpson for reinforcements and come back tonight. I want the three of you to stay and watch the place. If you see anyone else from Shaleslip Manor, try a little harder to capture them this time."
Barnes trotted off towards Shalebury, leaving Freddie and his companions behind. Not another soul was seen coming or going from Shaleslip Manor for the rest of the day. Freddie and his companions took shifts watching the land and napping in the shade of the trees. As the day waned and evening came to a close, Barnes returned.
"What news do you have?"
he asked, reining in his horse.
"No news. We ain't seen another person since you left."
"Mount up, then. Let us see what we can learn at the house."
The four men rode their horses between the trees, avoiding the road, getting as close to the house as they could without being seen. When they could go no farther, they tied up the horses and continued on foot. They crept into the gardens, hiding behind the topiaries and fountains as they surveyed the candle-lit windows. There seemed to be hundreds of them. The sheer enormity of their task seemed to hit all four at once, taking the wind out of their sails. The quartet crept around Shaleslip Manor for nearly an hour, peering into empty rooms and hallways before Barnes finally gave up and ordered them back to their horses. At the edge of the West Gardens where they had entered, Freddie cast a look over his shoulder at the house. He knew without a doubt that Mr. and Mrs. Poe were harboured at Shaleslip Manor. He even knew which third-floor room was theirs, as he had glimpsed Mrs. Poe through a crack in the drapes not long after their search began. He did not divulge this information to Barnes and the others. He did not believe in their quest and despised himself for not finding some way to extricate himself from his miserable situation. Instead, he kept silent as he and the others returned to Shalebury. Let them do their own dirty work for a change. He had to think of a way to sever his relationship with these men that would not cause his ruination and demise. Alas, no immediate solutions came to mind, at least none that did not involve murder. It was with great solemnity that Mr. Royse disclosed the truth to the entire staff at Shaleslip Manor, informing them of the impending danger. Everyone feared what would happen in the night, or perhaps on the morrow. As a result, it was a long and restless night, and no one at Shaleslip Manor slept well, least of all Gregory. He had joined Marjorie in bed, just as he always did, but once she was asleep, he slipped out from under the covers and stood at the window. The weight of the world rested on his shoulders. He could feel it bearing down on him, heavier than it had been in years. Not since his father died 3 years previous and left him master of Shaleslip from the relatively young age of 23 had he felt so burdened.
"Gregory, are you all right?"
Marjorie called softly from the bed.
"Yes. Go back to sleep."
Marjorie did not do as he said. She was perhaps the only person in the house who dared defy him. Folding back the counterpane, she swung her feet over the side of the bed and stood. Gregory opened his arms and welcomed her into his embrace. She eased herself into the hollow of his arms, a space, it seemed, perfectly fashioned for her. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her tight against his chest. Marjorie sighed and settled into him.
"Come back to bed. There is nothing more you can do tonight. It does no good standing here at the window worrying."
"I know, but it is better than lying in bed worrying. At least here I have the moon to look at."
Marjorie stretched up on her tiptoes and brushed her lips across his.
"You have me,"
she whispered.
"You will always have me."
"And I will never let you go,"
Gregory said as he tightened his arms around her and pressed his lips to hers. Marjorie, his dearest love and wife, was his greatest treasure. Never before had he worked so hard to gain anything as he did to gain her love. When they had first been introduced, she had teased him and laughed at him the entire 2 dances they had danced together. At the time, he had not known it was her way. He had thought her silly and ignorant, like the other girls so often thrust into his path and bandied about as a proper wife and mistress to Shaleslip. He had responded blandly, with little emotion, invoking a quizzical look from the lady. That was where his mistake ended. Marjorie had gathered her spirit and perfectly executed her wit when she declared him stoic, apathetic, and a downright disinterested doldrum. She declared in no uncertain and dismissive terms that she was bored with his attention, threw him a saucy smile, turned on her heels, and headed straight to her father.
Father, I thought you said he was intelligent and would offer refreshing conversation. By my word, he was duller than the dandy I danced with 20 minutes ago. It is safe to say I would have more fun watching the paint dry in Mother's newly refurbished sitting room than enduring another minute in that man's tedious company.
Ahem, my dear.
Her father had stretched out his arm and twirled his finger, indicating she should turn around to see who was behind her. Gregory had followed, intending to apologize for something, anything. Truth be told, he was not even sure what. But after that astounding set-down at the edge of the dance, he was determined to know her better, for it was obvious to his presently addled mind that this lady was in no way silly and ignorant like the others. She was, in truth, a rare gem, and despite her second set-down, which was clear she had not intended him to witness, he knew he had to have her, even if it meant tromping on his own pride. When Miss Marjorie Wells had turned around at her father's bidding, her eyes displayed mirth, not embarrassment. She was unrepentant of her little speech. She eyed him and pointedly asked,
Mr. Royse, how may I assist you?
Her words had not been what he expected, and he had made a further fool of himself when he answered,
Assist? I do not need assistance.
Very well then. Thank you for the dance. As you can see, I am safe with my father. You may leave me to his care.
She then shooed him away with a wave of her hand. He could hardly comprehend her. She had actually waved her hand as if she was waving away nothing more than an annoying fly from her person. Gregory stood a moment dumbfounded, with his mouth slack, unable to form words. She first raised an adorable eyebrow that lasted but a moment before she rolled her eyes and walked away, leaving his stupid person standing prostrate in front of her father. Mr. Wells had stifled a chuckle as he declared,
Go after her. You may not know it now, but you shall soon see she is well worth the effort.
He had been right. It had not been easy to regain, nay gain, her favour, but it had all been worth it. Now he would do anything to keep her safe and earn the faith she placed in him. Chapter 10.
There is a carriage coming 2 miles back.
Freddie said to Barnes as he pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted.
The driver and 2 footmen wear the Shaleslip livery, and the door bears the family crest. I cannot be positive, but it looks like there are 2 women inside.
How fortuitous.
Barnes turned to his men, who now numbered significantly more than 3.
Create a roadblock and stop the carriage. Let us hope there is someone inside we can use as leverage.
They had neither the time nor the means for an elaborate roadblock, but it would not take much to waylay a single carriage. By the time the carriage came into view, they had sufficiently blocked the road with a wall of horses and men. With handkerchiefs concealing their features, the mob of men surrounded the carriage even before it had come to a complete stop. Barnes stood in the center of the road in front of the carriage. He gestured at 2 men to take hold of the horses.
Climb down and stand over there,
he commanded of the driver. The driver, Mr. Starnes, kept hold of the reins and remained at his post. He had only recently graduated from stable hand to driver, and dealing with brigands was not something he had experience with. In the sudden rush of adrenaline, he completely forgot about the rifle stored in the compartment at his feet.
Who are you? What do you want?
I said get down and stand over there.
Barnes drew his pistol and pointed it at the driver.
You are trespassing on Shaleslip lands. Mr. Royse shall hear about this,
Mr. Starnes said, as he tied off the reins and climbed down from the box at gunpoint.
Yes, I hope he does. You 2 there on the back, get over here and join him.
The first footman immediately did as he was told. The second footman, a lad named Johnny Hale, defiantly placed himself between the ruffians and the carriage door.
I said, get over here!
Johnny stood rooted next to the carriage, unblinking in the face of danger.
This is the last time I will tell you. Move away from the carriage or be shot.
Barnes came around the carriage and stood directly before Johnny. A feminine cry came from inside, but Johnny remained. Freddie said a silent prayer that the stupid lad would abandon his heroics. It was all well and good to be willing to lay down one's life in the line of duty, but he would be no good to those women with his brains blown out. Mr. Barnes raised his pistol and pointed it at Johnny.
Don't be foolish, boy. I don't intend to harm the ladies. Step out of the way.
Johnny stood his ground.
Very well. Have it your way.
Barnes cocked the pistol and then aimed at Johnny's leg and pulled the trigger. Johnny fell to the ground, writhing in pain. A scream came from the carriage, cut off as if stifled by a gloved hand. The horses pranced and neighed, but the two men held them in place.
Get him out of my way.
Barnes demanded of Freddie and the man beside him. The two men grabbed Johnny by the arms, but he fought them off and regained his feet to stand again between them and the carriage. Freddie admired his tenacity. The bullet had made a ruin of his calf. That he found the strength to stand at all was something of a miracle. Barnes came closer and drew his second pistol. He cocked it and put the barrel against Johnny's forehead.
You will stop this at once, or the next shot will be one you will not recover from.
With his weight on his good leg, Johnny threw his head back and connected with the man who held him from behind. The man lost his balance and loosened his hold. Johnny scrambled to reach for the man's pistol, but Freddie had hold of him, and he could not get to it before Barnes acted. There was no warning this time when Barnes shot Johnny. The bullet caught him between the eyes, and Johnny fell dead.
Imbecile.
Barnes muttered as he turned to the carriage and flung open the door.
Tell me who you are at once.
There were two occupants in the carriage. The first was a middle-aged woman who looked well-bred and intelligent. She shielded a young woman behind her. The two cowered in fear, but neither spoke.
If you do not tell me who you are, I will shoot that man.
Barnes pointed at the other footman, who stood in shock next to the driver at the side of the road. He raised his pistol and took aim.
Miss Gemma Royse!
Gemma blurted out with a sob.
My name is Miss Royse, and this is my companion, Mrs. Miller. Please, sir, have mercy. I will tell you whatever you want to know.
Excellent. That was not so hard now, was it?
Barnes lowered the pistol and holstered it.
Miss Royse, it is a pleasure to meet you. Please, if you will, step out of the carriage. Your companion can stay.
Mr. Barnes offered her his hand to help her from the carriage. Gemma trembled with fear, but she accepted his hand.
I would prefer to come with Miss Royse,
Mrs. Miller said with as much courage as she could muster.
Miss Royse will be fine. You remain inside.
Once Gemma descended the stairs of the carriage, Mr. Barnes nodded to Freddie, who took hold of her by her arm just below her shoulder and urged her forward.
You two, get in the carriage with the companion. Don't forget to take him.
Barnes pointed at the body of the dead footman. Another cry came from Gemma as she caught sight of Johnny. Freddie gently turned her away from the mess. Barnes ordered a man to assume the driver's position and mounted his horse, following the carriage the rest of the distance to Shaleslip Manor. Almost as soon as he was gone, the trouble began, just as Freddie expected.
Well, you're a sight for sore eyes, and that's the truth,
shouted Big Joe, one of the crasser men of the group.
Miss Royse, if you will come with me,
Freddie said as kindly as he could. He could feel Miss Royse trembling as he led her away.
Don't take her away, Freddie. We want to look at her pretty face. Come on, darling. Stay here with us.
Another said, reaching out to touch Gemma's cheek. Gemma shrank away from him, her trembling increasing.
Get your hands off her. She is not to be touched by a single one of you,
Freddie said.
Are you going to stop us?
Big Joe said, flexing his enormous hands. Freddie placed himself between Miss Royse and the mob.
Yes, I am, and you'll thank me for it. Try thinking with your heads instead of your pricks. How happy will Barnes be if he comes back and finds his precious hostage ravished within an inch of her life? He can't trade damaged goods.
At the mention of Barnes, most of the men backed down, but Big Joe had less in the way of intelligence and foresight than the others.
We're just having a little fun,
he grumbled.
We won't hurt the girl.
You two come with me,
Freddie said, pointing at two of the younger and more pliable men.
The rest of you, get up there off the road and be ready when Barnes returns.
Who put you in charge?
Big Joe demanded.
I put myself in charge.
Freddie drew his pistol and pointed it at the cad.
Do you want to challenge me? We can go over in that field and pace it off if you like.
You think you're so much better than the rest of us?
Big Joe snarled.
You're not. You're just the same.
Freddie stepped close and leaned menacingly towards the man. Though Big Joe lived up to his name, Freddie was taller and could look down on him. Slowly enunciating each word, Freddie said,
I am nothing like you. Do as I say, or you will be eating the leads of my pistol.
Big Joe turned his head and spat on the toe of Freddie's boot.
I'll do as you say, but as soon as this job is done, you and I are having words. Come on, boys,
he said, turning away in disdain.
Get off the road and go over yonder by those trees. Oh, and Knox, mind you, tie up the girl good and proper. We don't want her getting away now, do we?
Big Joe tossed a length of rope to Freddie, who caught it. Then he stomped past the men and towards the stand of trees. The others followed, save the two Freddie had pulled aside. Freddie motioned for them to follow him as he led Gemma into the brush.
I hope you will be more comfortable out here, away from the men,
Freddie said.
I am sorry to have to do this, but I must tie your hands behind your back. Please turn around.
Please do not. I promise I will not run away,
Gemma pleaded in a small voice.
I believe you, but I cannot leave you unbound. I will be as gentle as possible.
Gemma turned her back to Freddie and put her arms behind her. He tied the rope, so it was tight enough to restrain her, but not so tight it chafed her or cut into her flesh.
How is that?
He asked when he was done.
It is fine,
Gemma replied.
Would you like to sit down?
Gemma nodded, and Freddie guided her to a nearby tree.
Here, I will help you.
Gemma sat with Freddie's assistance. She moved around a little to get into a comfortable position, and then said,
Thank you, sir, for your kindness.
What we have done to you is hardly a kindness. Waylaying your carriage, robbing you of your escort.
He killed him. That man murdered Johnny. He was only trying to protect me.
Gemma's voice shook with emotion.
I promise I will do my best to keep you safe while you are here. I will not allow you to meet the same fate. This business has gone on long enough, and someone needs to stand up to these men. It may as well be me.
Look, Gemma's carriage is coming,
Marjorie said when she saw the carriage trundling up the long drive.
At last, I've been so worried. Let us go down to meet her.
Gregory looked out the window and frowned.
Wait. Where are the footmen? And who is that riding on horseback?
Marjorie stared at him in horror.
Gregory, you don't think...
He shook his head and said,
Something is not right. I will go to meet the carriage. You stay here, and if nothing is the matter, I will send Gemma to you.
Marjorie nodded and returned to the window to watch the progress of the carriage, a worried frown creasing her brow. Gregory ordered the Poes to remain in their room and went to his study. He took a pair of pistols from their box, concealing them beneath his coat. He was waiting on the steps when the carriage rolled to a stop. Seeing the driver confirmed his uneasiness was justified. The man wore dirty workman's clothing and had a handkerchief tied over the lower half of his face. It was most definitely not Mr. Starnes. Something was terribly wrong. The horseman, also masked, nudged his mount to the front of the carriage.
Mr. Royse, I presume?
Who are you? Where is Mr. Starnes?
The man did not answer, but waited for the driver to tie off the horses and get down from the box. He opened the coach door and barked an order. One of Gemma's footmen stepped out first and then turned to help Mr. Starnes carry out Johnny's body. Finally, they handed down the distraught Mrs. Miller. There was no sign of Gemma.
What happened here? Where is Miss Royse?
Gregory demanded. The servants remained silent except for Mrs. Miller's crying.
I'll get right to the point.
The masked horseman said.
It has come to my attention you are harboring one Matthew Poe. You will turn him over to me now.
Mr. Poe? I do not know any Mr. Poe.
I know he is here, and I have come prepared to bargain. I have Miss Royse. I will trade her for Mr. Poe.
Are you mad? I already told you there is no Mr. Poe here. Return my sister to me this instant.
Let us not play games, Mr. Royse. Your sister's life is at stake. I suggest you hand over Mr. Poe. If you do, no one will get hurt.
No one will get hurt, you say? What of my footman?
Gregory pointed at Johnny Hale's body, his barely contained fury making his hand quiver.
That was unfortunate. I gave him every opportunity to save himself, but he simply would not comply. If you bring me Mr. Poe, your sister will not share his fate.
And if he is not here and I cannot produce him, what then?
You have 1 hour, Mr. Royse. I will meet you on the small hill near the stand of trees at Shaleslip's southern border. 1 hour, or I will send your sister back in a similar state as that footman lying over there.
Mrs. Miller cried out and fell to her knees on the gravel. The man pulled the driver up in the saddle behind him, and the two rode back the way they had come. Gregory wasted no time.
You.
He said to the surviving footman,
Find Mr. Jones and help him care for Johnny's body. Mr. Starnes, come with me. I need to know what happened.
The visibly shaken driver related the whole horrid encounter as he and Gregory helped Mrs. Miller into the house. She was inconsolable. Gregory handed her over to Mrs. Jones and said,
Take care of her. She's had a great shock.
Gregory, where is Gemma?
Marjorie asked in the foyer. Her voice trembled and her eyes were wide with fear.
Mr. Poe's enemies have found him. They have taken Gemma to ransom her for Mr. Poe.
Dear Lord, help us!
Marjorie exclaimed, her hand flying to her heart and tears slipping from her eyes.
What are you going to do?
I am going to get her back.
Gregory vowed.
Mrs. Jones, tell your husband to gather every able-bodied man and have him here and armed in 20 minutes.
Turning to his sister's driver, he said,
Starnes, tell me how many we are up against.
Chapter 11. Every able-bodied man, in Mr. Jones's view, included the footman set to guard the Poe's door. As soon as he was gone, Matthew and Martha left their rooms to see what was causing the commotion. They crept to the top of the grand staircase just in time to hear Mr. Royse address those gathered in the foyer.
Mr. Poe's enemies know he is here and have taken Miss Royse. They want to make a trade, but we cannot allow it. Neither can we allow them to harm Miss Royse. Johnny Hale, God rest his soul, already died protecting her. We will forever remember his sacrifice and honour him, and we will not let his death be in vain. We must rescue Miss Royse by any means necessary. Here is what we will do.
Gregory detailed the plan, then asked,
Any questions?
Every man shook his head and readied his weapons. The fear on the faces of some was not lost upon Gregory.
The task ahead is a dangerous one. I know each of you is scared. I would be lying if I said I was not. But we must conquer our fear. We must save Miss Royse. Please.
Overcome by emotion, he had trouble speaking further. Just as he regained his composure and voice, Mr. Poe came downstairs.
I never took you for a dim-witted fool, Mr. Royse. You cannot leave here and go after your sister. That is what they expect you to do.
No, they do not. They expect me to value my sister's life above yours and hand you over to them without a fuss. You were told to stay in your room out of sight until we called for you. Go back there immediately and lock the door behind you.
What am I to do here without protection?
I will not leave Shaleslip Manor unprotected. It will be safe here for you and your wife.
Now this is madness. As soon as you and your men are gone, they will come for me.
We are going, and you will stay here. Come, man, find your courage. You will be in far less danger than these men and my sister. Return to your room at once, or I will have you dragged there and lock you in myself.
The tone in Mr. Royce's voice brooked no opposition, and Mr. Poe returned to his room at the urging of his wife.
What would you have me do?
Marjorie asked, eager to help in whatever way she could.
Be prepared for our return. There will likely be injuries by blade or bullet. Prepare a place for the wounded and let us hope it will not be needed.
We will be ready,
Marjorie said as she kissed him.
Please bring her back.
We will.
Matthew stood at the bedroom window, looking down at the west gardens. The scene was deceptively peaceful, but he could sense the frenzy of activity taking place beyond his view.
Fools, the lot of them,
he growled.
He has to try,
Martha whispered.
He will fail. And when he does, he will trade me for his sister. I will not be traded.
Calm down, Matthew.
Calm down. Martha, do you have any idea what's going on? No, you could not. You have been safe at home while I've been running for my life, dodging bullets and assassins.
Matthew gestured at his shoulder as proof of how dangerous his lot was.
And I could have been there still had you not called me here. You knew they would be watching me.
I thought you would have no trouble outwitting Sharpson's lackeys. Since they are here in Shaleslip, it is obvious my faith in you was misplaced.
Now, this is my fault.
Martha turned angry eyes on her husband, staring him down.
No, it is not your fault. I am sorry,
Matthew said, trying to placate her. She was his one true ally in the house. He would be utterly lost if she turned against him.
You yourself told me you felt safe here. You said the Royses were the closest thing to honourable gentry you have ever met. Did you mean what you said about them, or was it all a lie to make me feel better?
No, I would never lie about something like that. The Royces are the best of people, but there is no telling what they will do in a circumstance like this.
I think you need to give Mr. Royse the benefit of the doubt. He said to wait here, and that is what we will do. I do not believe they will hand you over to killers.
It's a chance I'm not willing to take. I am leaving now, with or without you.
Marjorie was glad for the task of readying the house for the men's return, for it gave her something to do other than worry about her dearest love and her new sister. The thought of losing either of them made her physically ill. She did not know what she would do without them. Marjorie leapt into action as Gregory led the men on their quest to rescue Gemma. This was not a nightmare. It was real. This was happening. She was being tested again, and this time she was determined she would not be found wanting. In a calm, businesslike manner, she rattled off instructions to the few male staff left behind to offer what protection they could and directed the female staff to get to work.
Fill every empty pot with water and put them over the fire. I want hot water ready when the men return. Gather the old towels and sheets, cut them into strips for bandages, and boil as many as you can. Mrs. Jones, you go to the medicine closet and gather everything you can find. The rest of you gather the spare blankets and pillows. Bring everything to the ballroom and make up some pallets on the floor. We will turn it into an infirmary.
Let us pray we do not need it,
Mrs. Jones said.
Yes, pray. Pray for all the men. Pray they return to us unharmed and with Miss Royse.
The vast estate of Shaleslip had been Gregory Royse's personal wilderness during his youth, and no one knew every inch so well as he. For this reason, he led the search for Gemma with Mr. Jones at his side. The two shared a fierce determination to bring her home. The southern border of Shaleslip was not too great a distance, and their group of almost 40 rescuers made good time on horseback, some riding double. They stopped at the edge of the stand of trees and tied their horses. The rest of the distance they had to traverse on foot or risk early detection. The mob was a noisy bunch of about 20 gathered near the road. At first, Gregory did not see Gemma, But then Mr. Jones tugged at his elbow and pointed. There she was, sitting on the ground, with her hands tied behind her. Large, silent tears streamed down her pale cheeks. Nearby were two men, also sitting with their backs to trees. They were paying less attention to her than they should have, and Gregory took advantage of the opportunity provided to him.
Jones, I am going for Gemma. You watch those men, and if they so much as look in our direction, shoot them,
Gregory said. Mr. Jones nodded and turned to pass instructions down the line. Gregory sneaked up behind Gemma and silently dropped to his knees behind the tree she leaned against.
Be silent, dearest. It is me, Gregory.
He whispered, hoping she would not cry out in fear.
I am going to untie you. Can you lean forward a little?
Gemma did as he said, and Gregory untied her and helped her to her feet. The siblings had made it only 10 feet when a branch snapped underfoot and drew the guard's attention. The first guard let out a shout, and Mr. Jones fired his pistol. The bullet hit its mark, and he fell to the ground. The second stood momentarily stunned, then raced towards the group, raising the alarm. Mr. Starnes aimed and fired a second shot. His aim was also true, and the second guard dropped to the ground. Gregory and Gemma were now retreating north towards the horses as fast as their legs could carry them.
Return to Shaleslip Manor,
Gregory cried out. The entire group fell in around the siblings, surrounding them as they ran. A single shot rang out from far behind them, but it was impossible to know whether the shot made purchase. Gregory was relieved when none of his men cried out or fell. When they reached the horses, Mr. Jones untied Gregory's horse and handed him the reins as he vaulted into the saddle. He pulled Gemma up behind him, her skirts bunched up to her thighs, exposing her stockings.
Hold on,
Gregory shouted over his shoulder as he kicked his mount and urged him into a gallop across Shaleslip's fields. Gemma wrapped her arms around her brother's waist and held on for dear life. They had often galloped the horses, even raced one another across the fields, but never with this urgency. The staff of Shaleslip fell in around them, and every horse and rider ran for their lives, as if the devil himself nipped at their heels. Ahead, Gregory noticed a carriage on Shaleslip's road.
Who is that?
He shouted to the man who rode nearest them.
It's one of ours, sir.
We must stop them. Whoever it is, the mob will kill them.
Gregory turned the group and raced towards the carriage. As they neared, he could see it was Mr. Poe and his wife driving Gemma's carriage.
Are you daft, man? I told you to stay at Shaleslip Manor out of sight.
Gregory shouted as the carriage stopped.
They are right behind us. If you continue on this road, they will kill you.
Mr. Poe's eyes widened at the sight of the angry mob closing in behind Gregory's group, firing at the stragglers.
There is no time to return to Shaleslip Manor,
Gregory declared.
Come, we must take shelter in the old abandoned stables up ahead. Our only chance at survival is to hole up there. Everyone follow me. Starnies, you get up there and drive that carriage as if your life depended on it.
Now set on a fresh course, the group made its way to the old stables where the Shaleslip livestock used to live before Mr. Royse's father had new ones erected nearer the main house. The crumbling outbuilding was rarely used now. More shots rang out behind them, and a footman fired an answering shot before the boot boy, 10 years his junior, pulled him up short.
They're out of range, you dolt. Don't waste our ammunition.
When they got to the building, Gregory dismounted and helped Gemma off the horse. He took her by the hand and pulled her into the centermost stall of the stable.
Sit here and keep your head down. No matter what, Gemma. Do not move until I come for you.
He kissed the top of his sister's head and left the stall, closing the door behind him.
Get everyone inside,
he shouted over the noise of the men.
What about the horses?
Bring them inside if there is a room. If not, tie up their reins to the saddles and send them home. We will round them up later. Jones, Gemma is in the center stall. Protect her with your life. Poe, you and your wife should join her. I expect both of you to do exactly as Jones says and keep out of sight. Cross me on this, and there will be hell to pay. It is you they want.
5 men were at the doors, firing shots towards the angry men approaching. Another 5 had climbed into the hayloft and taken up positions where rotted and missing boards afforded them vantage points to shoot from. They exchanged a volley with the brigands, and a cheer went up through the Shaleslip men.
2 down.
We need someone reloading,
Gregory said. He pointed to the boot boy.
You there. Get a few others to help you and make sure these pistols stay loaded.
By now, the mob was surrounding the stable, taking cover behind dilapidated fences and feeding troughs and firing at the building. A Shaleslip man took a bullet in the leg and fell. Another man immediately snatched up his gun and took his position.
Hold steady, men. Pick your targets. Make every shot count,
Gregory shouted. A cry came from overhead as one man in the loft was struck. The hail of gunfire was deafening. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, and the haze of smoke made it difficult to see.
We're trapped in here like sitting ducks,
Gregory fumed.
We just need to hold out a little longer, sir.
Gregory recognized the voice of Daniel Scott, one of his most trusted footmen.
About half of them are dead or wounded. The way they've been shooting, they'll be out of bullets soon.
As if on cue, the hail of bullets from outside lessened and then stopped. There was silence for a moment, and then the remaining attackers rushed the stable door in a single body. The Shaleslip men fired into the mob, felling 2 of them, but the rest breached the door and swarmed into the stables. Gunfire was ill-advised in close quarters, so knives and swords were drawn. Never had Matthew Poe been as scared as he was right now. Even the day he had been shot and left for dead was not as scary as this. He could hear the shouts from the men rushing into the stables. He recognized Mr. Barnes's voice, which he had fully expected. But there was another, equally familiar voice in the cacophony.
Martha, did you hear that?
I cannot hear anything except the fighting,
his wife cried, cringing against him.
I would swear I heard Mr. Tabler out there shouting for my blood. He is Lord Gregory's man of affairs. If he is part of this, our deal must be off. You are right. They intend to kill me instead of paying me. Oh, why did I ever believe he and the others would honor our agreement?
Matthew raised his head and looked around. He and Martha huddled with Miss Royse at the back of the stall. Mr. Jones stood before them, 2 pistols drawn at the ready, aimed at the stall door. The sound of men fighting seemed to go on for eternity, but in truth it lasted but a few minutes. Then the latch on the stall door released, and the door swung inward, exposing Mr. Tabler coming towards them with a sword drawn, his makeshift bandit's mask knocked askew by the scuffle he had just waded through. Without hesitation, Mr. Jones fired a shot, blasting the man backwards.
Take that!
Mr. Jones yelled. He slammed the stall door shut again and resumed his stance with 1 less pistol.
If I live through this, I will testify against all of them,
Matthew vowed.
I will see them all hanged. I swear it. Mr. Jones,
he said with new resolve.
I know I'm to stay out of the fight. But if you've got a powder horn and ammunition, it would be my pleasure to reload your pistol.
Gregory had studied fencing under the finest masters in England, and he had always excelled at the sport. He had never thought to use his talents thus, but he would not shrink from pressing his advantage. He drew his sword from his scabbard and charged the incoming mob, cutting 2 men down before they had a chance to react. Then he came face to face with the same masked man who had come to the house.
I see you found your sister,
the man said wryly.
You know, I never would have hurt her. She is innocent in this. All you had to do was hand over Mr. Poe, and we could have avoided all this bloodshed. You should never have got involved.
He lunged and thrust his sword at Gregory's stomach. Gregory parried the thrust and lunged back at the man, who dodged swiftly and struck Gregory in the left arm. Whirling around, Gregory lunged a second time, catching the man off guard and scoring a fatal blow to his chest. The man staggered and fell to the ground, and there he stayed. Only 4 attackers remained. When they saw their leader fall, they dropped their weapons and surrendered.
Tie them up and bring them with us,
Gregory ordered.
Do not hurt them unless they resist.
Chapter 12. When Marjorie Royse heard men shouting outside and recognized the voices of her husband and Mr. Jones, she ran to the front door and threw it open. She had expected a few men to return wounded, but the scene before her was horrific.
"Where is Gemma?"
she called out anxiously. Blonde curls peeked out from behind Gregory on his horse.
Marjorie, I am here,
Gemma called out in a shaken voice. Gregory helped his sister from the horse, and she ran to Marjorie, throwing her arms around her neck and falling against her.
"Gemma, thank God, are you injured?"
"No, I am well. I received a great fright. Nothing more." Marjorie ushered Gemma inside into the waiting arms of her companion, then returned to Gregory, sitting tall in the saddle and issuing orders to the men in his usual calm manner, as if they all had not just been to hell and back.
Take our people inside and get them treated right away. Leave the others here in the drive. If you are uninjured, please remain here and guard these brigands. You acted courageously today. Your loyalty to the Royse family will not go unrewarded.
He turned his horse towards her, and Marjorie caught sight of the torn and bloodied sleeve of his coat.
"Gregory, you are injured!"
Nothing but a scratch, my love. There are men in far worse shape than me. I sent Daniel after Dr. Davies and anyone else in Shalebury with medical experience. They should be here shortly. Jared, escort the Poes to their room and station yourself outside the door. They are not to leave their room until Mr. Hammond arrives to collect them.
Marjorie went closer and placed her hand on his leg.
"Gregory, please,"
she pleaded.
"let the others take care of things out here. You should come inside and let me see to your arm."
Not now, I must see to...
"No, it can wait."
Marjorie could be just as stubborn as her husband when she needed to be. Then, with a softer voice, she added,
"Please, do it for me. Come inside and let me see for myself that you are well. If it is just a scratch, as you say, then I will bandage it properly and you can return to your duties."
With a sigh, Gregory agreed. He got down from his horse and made to follow her inside, but his knees went weak and he stumbled. Mr. Jones and another man were there to catch him.
"Bring him inside quickly,"
Marjorie said, leading the way to the makeshift infirmary in the ballroom.
"Over here. Lay him down. Sally, hand me those scissors,"
she said to a maid, feverishly cutting old sheets into strips. Sally handed over the scissors and took to tearing the sheets with her bare hands. Marjorie used the scissors to cut up the length of Gregory's sleeve to expose the wound.
"Oh, Gregory,"
she gasped when she saw the extent of the injury. She gently probed the lacerated flesh once and then called out,
"Water! I need hot water and rags over here."
Sally was there in an instant. She wet a rag and wrung it out, taking care not to burn her hands in the scalding water. Then she handed the hot rag to Marjorie and repeated the task to be ready with another when needed. Marjorie did her best to clean the wound, but blood was welling out at an alarming rate.
"This is far more than a mere scratch. We need to stem the bleeding until Dr. Davies arrives,"
Marjorie said as she pressed a folded cloth against Gregory's arm and held it there.
"Here, let me,"
said the man who had helped carry Gregory in.
"You're being too gentle."
He nudged Marjorie aside and took her place, bracing Gregory's arm with one hand and pressing on the bandage with the other. Gregory winced slightly against the pain, and soon the flow of blood lessened to a slow trickle. Marjorie kissed his forehead and fussed over him until the doctor arrived a few minutes later. Though his wound was not the worst, Gregory was the first patient Dr. Davies tended to when he arrived. With the bleeding already under control, it was a simple matter to stitch it closed and bandage it.
How does that feel?
Dr. Davies asked.
Can you feel the stitches pulling?
Gregory moved his fingers, hand, elbow, and then, finally, his entire arm.
No, everything seems to be in order. You do fine work, Doctor. I have much to do. Mr. Royse, I advise you to get plenty of rest. You will be weak for a day or two.
Dr. Davies picked up his physician's bag and went to his next patient.
Where is the man who assisted me? I would like to meet him,
Gregory said. Marjorie spotted the man helping Mr. Jones carry the more severely wounded into the ballroom. She did not like to distract him from his errand of mercy, and so she waited until he was through before asking him to wait upon her husband. The man reluctantly agreed, and it was with some trepidation that he approached the makeshift pallet where Gregory reclined.
I am sorry I did not ask before, but what is your name, sir?
Gregory asked.
Frederick Knox.
Do you work for the Derby Mill Masters?
That's a difficult question, sir.
It is not so difficult. You do not work for me, though you seem to be doing your best to give that impression.
Freddie gave him a rueful smile.
I was hoping you would be none the wiser. And you were, for a while. I took off my mask and joined your men as soon as you snatched your sister. I should have known better than to press my luck by sticking around after the action, but I wanted to do what I could to see that you and your people suffered no lasting damage.
You astound me, Mr. Knox. You do not seem the type to consort with kidnappers and murderers. I would very much like to hear your story.
I was an action agent in the British Secret Service until a few years ago. Now I act as an inquiry agent for the public. When I accepted the position from Lord Sharpson and the Derby Mill Masters, I was told the job was to dig up some information related to lead mining trade agreements. Before I knew what they really hired me to do, I was in too deep to get out. They will ruin me for my actions today. Lord Sharpson and his cronies will see to that. But I couldn't stand by any longer. I may not be a saint, Mr. Royse, but I have morals and a conscience.
On the ride back from the old stables, Gemma told me one of her abductors protected her from the others. That was you, was it not?
It was.
For your kindness to her and to me. I will speak on your behalf when the authorities arrive. If it is within my power to prevent or mitigate your ruination at Lord Sharpson's hands, I will do it.
Thank you, Mr. Royse. I have heard much of your goodness during my brief stay in Shalebury. You are indeed everything they say of you and more.
Though every man and woman in Shalebury with medical training descended on Shaleslip en masse, it took the entire night and well into the following morning to care for all the wounded. Whether it was by some miracle or by more practical means, not a single Shaleslip man beyond poor Johnny had been killed. Some, like the outspoken boot boy, would carry scars for the rest of their lives. But what a tale they could tell. Gregory was weak from the loss of blood, and could not help as he wished. Marjorie entreated him to retire to their rooms, but he would not hear of it. If he could not be part of the action, he wished to oversee and direct as his position dictated. Marjorie was likewise deaf to his pleas that she retire, insisting she would rest when it was over and everyone was cared for. The Shalebury Constabulary arrived to take charge of the surviving brigands and begin the long process of gathering up and identifying the dead. Freddie Knox again offered his services. He knew only a few by name, but in most cases he could match faces to employers. And it soon became clear that every one of the Derby Mill Masters had had a hand in the affair. Weary yet satisfied, Gregory and Marjorie retired early the next day and slept through the following night, too exhausted to even contemplate what Lord Sharpson's next move might be. The Poes were safe for now, and Mr. Hammond was expected on the morrow. There was nothing more they could do. Hammond arrived early the next morning and was shown immediately to Gregory's study.
I came as soon as I could. You have done a good thing, Mr. Royse.
A good thing? I did what I had to. Do you know they took my sister? They waylaid her carriage on the road and tried to ransom her in exchange for Mr. Poe. I risked 40 men's lives to get her back. That is not a good thing.
It may not seem so now, but it was a very good thing indeed. Word of what happened has travelled remarkably far, and this morning we took all 6 of the Derby Mill lead mine masters into custody. They arrested Lord Sharpson while trying to flee the country. I am positive we have sufficient evidence to hang the lot. You and your men brought this long and arduous investigation to an end, perhaps saving countless lives in the future. For that I will forever be grateful."
A rustle came from behind him, and Mr. Hammond turned to see Mrs. Royse entering with Mr. and Mrs. Poe.
"Mrs. Royse, it is a pleasure to see you again."
Mr. Hammond bowed as she moved to stand by her husband.
"I am rather glad to see you too, Mr. Hammond."
He fully comprehended her words, but offered no response.
Mr. Royse, sir.
Mr. Poe said from the door.
"How can I thank you for what you have done for me and my wife?"
"There is no need to thank me."
"Yes, there is. I have to repay you somehow."
"Testify and finish what you started. That will be payment and thanks enough."
"I will, Mr. Royse, I promise."
"I will send my own agents for the Derby Mill men who are still alive and collect the others for burial,"
Mr. Hammond said as he stood up to take his leave.
"There is one man I wish to speak to you about,"
Gregory said quickly.
"Frederick Knox did me and my sister a great service. I would speak on his behalf at his trial."
"Are you sure?"
"I am."
"As you wish,"
Mr. Hammond said.
"I have one other piece of news for you. Your young man, Charlie, could not return with me. They accosted him on his wild ride to Derby and took a bullet in the arm. The surgeon was able to save the limb, but he cannot travel at present. He wished me to tell you he will return with your prized hunter as soon as possible."
Gregory nodded his thanks and shook hands with Mr. Hammond. The Inquisitor bid them a last farewell and led the Poes out to the carriage waiting in the drive. Marjorie breathed a sigh of relief when the driver snapped the reins and the carriage disappeared up Shaleslip Manor's drive. Epilogue. It had been several days since Marjorie had roamed the gallery on the second floor, inspecting the portraits of Royse's past. The last time she had been there, Mr. Poe had still been in residence, and she had been afraid. She'd sought refuge in this place, seeking guidance from those who came before her. One painting in particular had caught her attention then. She returned to it now and stood beneath the portrait of George Royse, taking the time to inspect it closer. George was right where she had left him, sitting proudly upon his grand stallion. He had his hand on his sword hilt, ready to fight for those he loved, for those he had a duty to protect. When Marjorie had looked at the painting before, she had thought George looked very much like her husband, especially his serious expression. Now, she better understood the significance. To bear the name Royse meant something. Royse was not the name of a family who shirked their duties or turned away from a fight. It was the name of a family who charged into battle to protect those who depended on them, to protect those who could not protect themselves, and to do it without thought of reward. Marjorie walked farther down the gallery, inspecting the portraits of Royse women. Gemma Royse, now sister. Anne Booth Royse, Gregory's mother, who had died when he was still a boy. Muriel Ascot Royse, Alice Westenham Royse, Beatrix Royse, Katrina Levenhall Royse, and Philippa Royse. Some women, like Philippa, Beatrix, and even her beloved sister Gemma, wore serious expressions. Others, like Katrina, Alice, Muriel, and Anne, wore light-hearted and almost playful expressions. Marjorie stopped in front of Gemma's portrait and looked up at it.
"What about you, dearest? Do you feel the Royse burden of duty upon your shoulders, as your brother does?"
Then, all at once, it hit Marjorie full force. Rushing back to the carved nameplates under each image, she inspected them. Sure enough, her suspicions were correct. Every woman born a Royse held a look of serious contemplation, as if the weight of the world rested upon her shoulders. The others, those Royse women who had laughter in their eyes and a genuine smile upon their lips, were women who had married into the family. They were the women who brought joy and happiness into these walls, which otherwise would have been dark and oppressive under the burden of so many generations of familial obligation. Marjorie vowed that when she had children, she would teach them, male or female, to smile and laugh. She did not intend to destroy generations of traditions passed from father to son, but she would help them see the joy in life, to feel happiness, to feel love. She was standing under the painting of her husband when the man himself came upon her and took her hand. She smiled up at him.
I have decided, my love. Our children will learn the duties of a Royse, but learn to execute them like a Wells.
Gregory regarded his wife with curiosity.
As you wish, my dear.
Do you not want to know what I mean?
Marjorie asked, her bright eyes teasing and full of mirth.
I do, if you will tell me.
She told him of her epiphany, and never again would either of them look upon the portraits in the gallery in the same way. Instead, they would inspect a portrait and guess the subject's parentage before reading the nameplate to discover if they were correct. 9 times out of 10, Marjorie's epiphany was correct. There was one portrait, however, that they would always wonder about. One Roy's daughter who had lived almost a century ago, whose radiant smile the artist had captured perfectly. What had she known that the rest had never learned? The end.